The night had a taste to it, a clean edge of iron and pine that lay under the tongue and would not leave. The wall breathed in the cold and breathed out the cold, a living, pale thing that went on and on into a darkness with no end. Jon stood along the Merlin, black cloak wrapped close, the fur at his throat stiff with rime. Lantern light swayed in the cutouts along the rampart and cast long ribs of gold across the ice. Nothing moved to the north but the wind, and even that he felt more than heard. The wall carried sound oddly, swallowing what it did not wish to keep. Ghost was at his feet, a colder white than the ice, eyes like banked coals in snow. He listened to Ghost's breathing. He wondered, as he had often wondered lately, whether he could learn a different kind of listening if he tried. If he could stand here and hear instead the slow heartbeat of the world rooting down beneath the wall, the roots twining through black earth and older stone, the seasons turning somewhere beyond the reach of his breath. He closed his eyes and might have done it then, might have fallen forward into whatever lay between skin and star, but the lantern nearest him clicked as oil shifted and the ordinary world declared itself once more. "Cold bites sharper tonight," PYP had said earlier with his grin, shrugging his way into a second pair of gloves that did nothing. Jon had nodded and said nothing in return. He did not plan on more words than necessary tonight. There were days for words, nights for silence. There were days to be a brother clever with a jape, nights to be a black shadow along a white wall, eyes open and mouth closed while the wind remembered the dead. Ghost rose without sound and turned his head, something catching him that was not sight or scent alone, and Jon felt it too, like a finger passing lightly over the hair on his forearms. He bent, fingers in the deep pelt by Ghost's shoulder, and looked north, past the lantern ribs into the thicket dark. Nothing and everything to see, yet Ghost went still as carved marble, and the small muscles along Jon's spine drew tight in recognition. He heard it then, not the wind but a different scrape and clink, then the duller echo of a voice tossed up hollow from below, thin with the cold. The lift creaked, a wheel complaining as the outer cage came up empty. Then the inner gate chains stirred and sighed, and a moment later there was a tapping at the postern gate along the inner parapet that led to the stair. The gate ward's lantern rocked once. Jon saw the ink-black limbs of the man who carried it, and the pale snow caught in his beard. The man raised the lantern and blinked up at Jon. "Halder, broad where the world was narrow." "Watcher," Halder called softly, as if a loud word would crack the ice under their feet. "Rider from the south, Mole's Town way, says he's got a letter for the Lord Commander. Says it's from the swamps." Jon's hand stilled on Ghost's shoulder. He felt his mouth form the word before the breath came to fill it. "The neck, that's it." Halder scratched his cheek under the wool. "The little men. Looks one to me. He's wrapped up like an egg in straw, but small. Old eyes." Crannogman did not often come to the wall. No one often came to the wall anymore except those who meant not to return. The last man out of the neck Jon had met had been a peddler with lye-burned fingers and a sack full of needles who had smelled of peat and fish guts. He told stories like unspooling rope, slow and oddly comforting, of trees that walked and water that sang. Jon found his hand tightened into Ghost's pelt until the dire wolf exhaled a slow warning breath through his nose. He let go. "Take him to the Lord Commander," Jon said. His voice came out steady, without ambition. "I'm to do it," Halder said. "And you're to come too if you like." He asked if the boy with the white wolf still lived. I told him there were no boys here. Still, it's you he meant. The tightness along Jon's spine moved, softened, lifted. Ghost's tail brushed his boot, and the direwolf's ears pricked forward, the way they did when he had a scent he liked. Jon nodded once, and Halder's lantern bobbed and went. The stair was cold iron, old as a curse, and a thin rhyme for steps. Jon descended with a careful rhythm. Ghost's paws soundless along the iron and then softer still upon the packed snow at the base. The yard was a long blue haze where lantern light and moonlight folded together. The main door to the Lord Commander's quarters was open a finger's width. Lamp glow flickered upon stone. Jeor Mormont had not so much a room as a den. Even when the fire was banked high, there was a cave feel, the heavy squareness of stone and the smell of smoke cured into wood. The bare sigil inked into the leather chair back was dim with long use, and a bearskin lay near the hearth, its flattened head as if listening. Mormont himself was in the chair, wrapped in a black fur that might have been 1,000 raven wings stitched together, and his great bearded face was the color of old iron under lamplight. Beside him stood Maester Aemon, wrapped and hooded, a spirit of winter given human patience, his eyes like milky pearls that had learned to look inward and outward both. Between them, small and narrow and hooded, the Crannogman stood. He carried no spear, only a short knife at his belt with a handle of something that should have been wood but had the pallor and patina of bone. His legs were bound in reed-woven greaves, and there were stains on his glove edges that might have been peat. His face was weathered to the toughness of old leather, but the lines did not pull deep. There was something fluid in his stillness. "Jon," Mormont said, without lifting his voice, "close that door. The wind's eating my fire." Jon did as he was told, and the night shut itself out. He brought Ghost to heel with a touch and took a place off to the side. The Crannogman's head turned and lifted, not toward Jon but toward Ghost, as if there were a sound only he could hear. His mouth shaped a word Jon could not catch. "This one says he is from the swamps, and the man he comes from is a friend of your father's," Mormont said. "Men have died in my hall for smaller claims, but Maester Aemon says the seals are true." The Lord Commander's hand lifted, and Jon saw a roll of brown-stained parchment bound with a wax seal as pale as milk. The wax had been pressed with a stone or something like one. It bore a direwolf in shallow relief, angular, crudely done, not the neat sigil that might have come from a lord's ring. Yet Jon knew that shape, as a man may know his father's shadow across an open door. He knew the tilt of its ear. "From Howland Reed," the Crannogman said, and his voice had the timbre of water running over wood, the words reed soft, the consonants light. "He bids me tell you that the river remembers the stone, and that the debt of the marsh to the wolf is not counted in coin. He bids me give this to Jon son of Eddard." The man paused, eyes moving a fraction as if he measured a change in the room that was visible only to him. "And this to Robb son of Eddard. The second is not to be opened by any hand but Robb Stark's, in the presence of trusted kin or oath brothers. The first—" He lifted a small packet wrapped in oiled cloth, old oil by the smell. "The first is for the one with the white wolf, if he is that one." "He is Jon Snow," Mormont said, brusque, "and no one's son in the eyes of the law but the Night's Watch's sworn brother." The Crannogman inclined his head, as if he had known something and had it confirmed. The packet in his hand was not larger than a man's palm. He stepped toward Jon with the sure foot of a man in a bog who knows which hummock will bear his weight. Up close, Jon smelled tanned hide and the iron-cold scent of standing water, and underneath it, a faint sweetness, as if the man had kept dry grass in his hood for comfort. The knife handle at his belt was indeed bone, but not a man's or deer's, something pale as the inside of a shell with faint red veining. "Take it," the Crannogman said. "He told me I would know the winter child by his companion. There are not many white wolves left to choose from." Jon took the packet. The oiled cloth was tied with a strip of reed like old rope grown brittle. He cradled it in both hands and did not move. The thing had weight but not much. It was not a dagger and not a pebble. It was too square and too careful. He knew before he opened it that it would smell like wooden chests and old ink and the red leaves of the gods would in wet weather. "Might as well do it," Mormont said, as if the words came through his teeth. "Whatever it is, it should be known." "Maester," Aemon was already moving. The old man's hands were clever in their slow way, as if speed was a vanity he had learned to leave to others. He took the packet from Jon and moved it under the lamplight. The old eyes could not read, but his fingers read the seal like a second sight. He nodded once and gave it back. "The wax is old," he said softly. "It has not been warmed and pressed again. The reed binding is from the neck, the pattern is as they do, woven down and then up. Carries the smell of peat that has dried many years and been kept dry since. There is no trick of the hall about it. It felt to Jon as if he stood at the edge of a river and the earth were damp under his boots for the first time in a long time and a long way from home. He worked the reed binding free. The oiled cloth unrolled, stuck a little and slipped like skin. Inside lay a folded piece of parchment, small as a hand and twice folded. There was no seal on it. Either it had never had one or someone had broken it long ago. The outside bore a line in a hand Jon knew without needing to know. A hard, clean hand that made a line where a lesser man would have made a flourish. For Jon, it said. How many words there were? Only 3. It might as well have been 100. He unfolded it. The ink had aged to a brown with a shadow of red still in it, as if the pen remembered blood. Jon read. The words did not change under his eyes. When he reached the end, he read again, because sometimes words say one thing and mean another, and the second reading shows a different face. They did not change. The room had no body then, no edges. There was the letter and his hands and Ghost's steady breathing, and the sound he was not aware he was making under his breath until he stopped making it. He did not know how long he stood like that. He became aware of the feel of the parchment's edge pressed into his thumb. He became aware that Maester Aemon's head was turned toward him with a listening that was not to sound. He became aware of Mormont's heavy face and the way the Lord Commander's fingers curved on the chair arm as if about to close. The Crannogman had gone as still as stones in water. Ghost's nose touched Jon's knee, a weightless tap, and the world breathed again. Jon handed the parchment to Maester Aemon. Perhaps that was mad. Why should anyone else read what was for him? He did it anyway. Aemon could not see. But Aemon could read with other senses, and if this thing were a lie, the old man would smell the lie. Aemon took the parchment with a care that spoke of reverence rather than frailty and tilted it into the light. He said nothing for a long time. He lifted the parchment and touched the dried ink to his lips, as if tasting some memory of the hand that had written it, and lowered it again. It is Eddard Stark's hand, Maester Aemon said, a fact as calmly delivered as naming the season. I have seen it before. He wrote once to the wall when Benjen Stark first took the black, and again when he was made Lord Hand, asking after our stores. He wrote without ornament, as he lived. Mormont grunted. Speak it. It is short, Aemon said, and there was a warmth in his voice that had not been there a moment before, like a room with a shutter opened. It tells the boy what he has always been owed and never given. It tells him his mother's name and his father's. It tells him the promise that bound a man's life. It asks him for forgiveness that he is not here to give this with his voice. Mormont's great brows met. Who? The mother is Lyanna, sister to Eddard Stark, Aemon said, and Jon saw the shape of the name move through the room like cold through stone. The Lady Lyanna was a statue in the Winterfell crypt in Jon's memory, a girl's face in marble with a crown of winter roses fallen at her feet. She had been a story of riding fast and laughing faster and promising to pick a new flower every season and never keeping her promises. She had been an old ache in the house, a shadow that sometimes crossed Catelyn Stark's face when she thought no one saw her thinking, another part of the map of grief by which the Stark household navigated its days. Hearing her name here now was like being told the very air had bones in it. And the father, Maester Aemon said, quieter still, is Rhaegar Targaryen. In the silence that followed the word, Jon heard the pop of a pine knot in the hearth and the settling of old wood in the beams and the small noise the Crannogman made without making a noise. He had the sense of a catskin being stroked the wrong way. Mormont's breath came out hard, like a blow. The prince, Aemon said. He stole the girl, Mormont said, as if the bare naming of the old rumor could puncture the seal of the letter. Or she ran to him, or both. None of it matters now. It matters who the boy's father is, if the letter is true. It matters for him. It matters for others. Jon thought, others. He was a brother of the Night's Watch, sworn to father no sons and hold no lands and wear no crowns. He was a part of a we, dawn to dusk, a thread in a black cloak. Others was the name of the old dead who were not dead and walked with cold blue eyes beyond the wall. Others was also everyone south of the wall who had never looked north except in fear. He could not yet conceive of himself as an other in another sense, part of a story that would be told under banners he was not allowed to bear. He felt as if his skin were too small to hold the words. He wanted to be alone and did not want to ever be alone again. He wanted to run. He wanted to stand still. He wanted his father, and the wanting was a new wound in a place that had already scabbed over 100 times. He had thought he was done with longing for things he could not have. He found he was not done. "What does the letter say to me?" Mormont demanded, impatience hardening his voice into something like a cudgel. "Does Reed send word for me? Does he call me fool or friend? Does he ask me to sew a royal cloak for one of my men?" "The Crannogman brought 2 letters," Aemon said, "and the second bears the direwolf seal unbroken. It is for Robb Stark." He turned his head toward Jon, and in the old man's face there was not sympathy, which would have been an insult, but an attention so whole that Jon felt steadied by it. Eddard Stark bade his son know what his brother knows, and to see the hand that wrote it. Mormont's eyes moved off Aemon and fixed on Jon. "Well?" he said, and there was a contained violence in the word, like a blade not yet drawn. "What do you want to do?" "Night's Watch business is my business. I would know the shape of it before it moves." Jon did not think. He did not look for cleverness in himself. He was empty of cleverness. He said the thing that rose whole in him. "I should take the letter to Robb," he said. "I should tell him myself. This is not for a raven. It's for a face. Robb should hear it from my mouth." "The boy wants to go south," Mormont said, in a tone that might have been scorn or might have been merely a man who has seen many men want things. "The boy will remember he is no boy and cannot go where he likes. The Night's Watch is not a bridge for men to cross when it suits them." Ghost's head lifted, and he looked from one man to the other, the slow turn of an ancient predator measuring 2 trees in a forest to see which would fall first in a storm. Jon stared at the Lord Commander and felt his face grow hot, half out of shame, half out of something hard and straight that was not pride. "I will return," he said. The promise was out before he could weigh it. "I will take the letter to Robb. I will say to him what is written there. I will come back." "A man who leaves the Night's Watch to take letters south is a deserter," Mormont said. "A man who deserts from the Night's Watch for a cause he thinks noble." He raised his hand and let it fall. "Hangs the same as the one who runs for a girl with red hair or a purse of coin. I will not have it that there are 2 kinds of betrayal. There is one. You swore with your mouth and your father's sword. That oath is the only coin you left to call your own." "Lord Commander," Maester Aemon said, the mildness in his voice like a cloth placed over a hot dish, not to cool it, but to allow it to be carried. "There is another coin that may purchase something here. We might send him. He might carry the Lord Commander's words as well as his father's. If the Watch has need of men and bread and iron, who better to go to the son of Eddard Stark? The North loves its own. A brother with a direwolf would not be unheard by Robb Stark. I am old enough to see 2 sides of a line and know they do not always cut." Mormont's stare slid off Jon and settled on the fire a long moment. "I do not like how that sounds," he said. "It sounds like we are merchants of vows, selling a little of one honor to buy much of another." "None of us like it," Aemon said. "Do we like the thing beyond the wall that breathes in a place that should have no breath? Would we like to set it at the threshold of our hall and watch it come in because we keep the neatest sums in our ledgers of duty? The old tales say a winter once came when men starved beside full chests because a law forbidden to break was a law they knelt to until their knees froze. The Crannogman moved then, a small shift that admitted he existed outside of being a messenger. "I was bid to say this if there was doubt," he said, eyes lowered but voice clean. "My Lord Reed told me to bring back an answer if he could not come himself. He bids the Lord Commander remember this. The marsh owes the wolf and there are debts to pay. If the Night's Watch needs men, the neck can spare men who will not water their courage with ale and run south when the wind turns north. We can bring spears that do not break and boats that will make a river in any frozen ditch." He lifted his head an inch, the movement like a ripple over a pool's surface. "But only if the news that belongs to the wolf reaches the wolf's den before it is shouted from the battlements of other men. Do I look like a man who wants the battlements to do my shouting? Mormont snapped, but the snap was a little less sharp than it might have been a moment ago. He drummed his fingers on the chair arm. His beard moved fractionally with his breath. Finally he said, "If I send him, he goes as mine. He carries my words, and he wears my black. He is to be taken for an emissary of the Night's Watch, and not a desert-sprung brat running to his brothers for a favor." Jon found, to his own surprise, that his throat was closing. He had not expected, not leniency, not forgiveness, something else. He could not have shaped the word even to himself. Permission. The Lord Commander was not giving him his oath back to do as he liked. He was binding him tighter, and by doing so pulling him across a line he could not have crossed alone. The room steadied more. "I go as you say," Jon said, and the words were simple and felt clean in his mouth. "Say it to the steward and the first ranger," Mormont said. "Tell them you will be gone and why. Take the good horse, not the one with the frozen fetlock. And take men, if any you want, that I can spare. I can spare none, but I will be spared." He grimaced as if his own mouth disobeyed him. "Take the bow you favor, and as many arrows as will not empty the chest. The king's road is lined with men who think themselves wolves. Ghost will make some think again, but not all. I will go with him," the Crannogman said, as if the matter had been decided elsewhere already. "I know the slow places and the places that look slow. I know how to fold a day and take 2 out of it if one must be quiet." Mormont snorted. "Fold a day? If you can do that, I'll have you fold me 7 and put them on the end of this winter. But go then. Old man, write me my letter. I will tell the boy king what I think of kings while we starve up here. Jon." Mormont's eyes caught him with iron again. "You will come back." "I will come back," Jon said, and this time there was no need to decide to say it. The thing had already been said inside him. The tasks that came after were a comfort like stacking wood that would be needed later. Close work, no room for thought beyond the measure of a piece and the placement of your hands. In the armory, Donal Noy grunted and shook his head before he said anything, which was the way of a man who had known too many metals that weren't what they said they were. "South," he muttered. "Well, it won't be the first time a good piece of iron got carried away where it won't be treated right." He had Jon try 3 bows and 3 more until the pull was clean and the string sang comfortable under his fingers. He gave him a quiver with 2 sets of arrows, one fletched in raven, one in white goose. "Black when you need it, white when you need it," Donal said, as if that were a secret he would tell no one else. "And take oil. The frost eats bowstrings in a way that makes a man doubt his own strength. It's not that you've grown weaker, it's that the cold is a thief." In the kitchens, Hobb thrust a sack into his hands and another into the Crannogman's, full of hard oatcakes and dried beef and the kind of cheese that had its own opinion about time. "Eat like you mean to live," Hobb said. "And don't give the marsh boy all the good bits because he's small. Small men live as long as big men if they chew as well." He looked at the Crannogman with open curiosity. "You got a name?" "Haw-er," the man said, speaking as if setting a leaf on water to see if it would float. "Haw-er," Hobb repeated, making the shape of the word his own. "Well then, haw-er. Eat like a man and shit like a man and don't get any of your swamp in my pots." He grinned suddenly, a flash of uneven teeth that made light of the words he had thrown. "I hear you fold days. Fold me one where the stew keeps itself from burning while I sleep. Will you?" Har regarded him with the grave interest of a man taking the measure of a new plant. "A stew will keep if you cover the pot with wet moss and keep a pebble on the lid to remind it of the weight of earth," he said. "But the moss will smell swampy and the men will complain." "We complain anyway," Hobb said, satisfied, and waved them off. Sam came to the yard with his cloak half askew and his breath steaming. He had not been able to keep the news from his face. Sam's feelings were things that lay on his skin where anyone might see them, and Jon loved him for it. Sam did not ask to come, which meant Sam had already thought of coming and had already thought of what the cold and the way men were south along the road would do to him. He took Jon's hands in his own gloved paws and squeezed, gentle as if Jon were made of glass. "You'll tell him," he said, and his voice shook. "You'll tell Robb. And then you'll come back and we'll go on the ranged with Gren like we said, and you'll tell me what the Riverlands look like and whether there are herons." "There are herons," Jon said. He did not know if there were. The Riverlands were in war, but there had been once and would be again. "I'll bring you a feather." "I should give you something," Sam said. A boy again for an instant, flushing, fumbling in his cloak. He produced a little leather bag like the kind boys keep marbles in, and within it a smooth round stone, gray and ordinary, except that when Jon turned it in his hand it caught a light from somewhere and held it with a depth that made his fingers feel clean. "I know it's silly," Sam said. "I found it down near the kennels in the first week, and it's nothing but a river stone that's gotten old under the wall. But it feels nice to hold when the night is long." Jon closed Sam's fingers over the stone again and left it with him. "Keep it," he said. "Hold it when the night is long. I'll hold this." He reached down without looking and took a pinch of Ghost's fur between two fingers, and Ghost stood and pressed his flank against Jon's leg, solid as a promise. He slept a few hours as men sleep when they are leaving, a shallow drift that feels like lying underwater. In his dream he stood in the Godswood at Winterfell. The heart tree bled its red leaves around him, and the pool held a gray sky that had not yet decided whether to snow. The statue of Lyanna Stark in the crypt was not in the dream, but he felt her absence like a face turned away. He woke with the taste of cold steel in his mouth and the sound of a song he had never learned fading into the place where the dream had gone. The song had a harp in it. He listened and heard only the wind and Ghost's breath and the creak of a harness leather as horror gathered their things in the outer room. They left by the east gate while the sky wore a pallor like bone under thin skin. The lift down the wall made the world recompose itself in layers. Ice to stone, stone to timber, timber to earth. At the bottom, the cold was a different cold, with a little damp in it that you could smell in your hair. Ghost went out before them with a stride like a river that had remembered its course. Har moved in a way that never seemed to disturb the snow he stepped upon. He had a way of pausing at places where there was nothing to see, a small cant of his head as if to a bird calling, and then moving on with a course altered by a finger's width. Jon felt, after a few hours, that he was walking with a man who carried a map under his skin, not of roads but of the secret threads between road and water and route. Mole's Town was a cluster of smoke smells under snow. A woman with a red scarf that had once been bright laughed as she saw Ghost and put her hand over her mouth. A boy ran and then did not run, his eyes round with the kind of fear that has not yet decided whether it is fear of danger or fear of the story. He will be able to tell later. Har's eyes were kind to them without looking at them. They did not stop. They took the King's Road, such as it was, a dark ribbon between white fields and darker woods where charcoal burners had left black rings under the trees. The frozen ruts sang under the horses' hooves in a thin, tinkling way that made Jon think of glass. They rode until the horses were steaming and then rode again. When they made camp, Har built the fire in a shape Jon had never seen, a low, shallow cradle that ate less wood and gave a deep, slow heat. "It is a winter's bed," he said when Jon asked, "not a summer's dance." On the second day, a band of men appeared where the road bent through a stand of bare alders. They had leather jackets with bits of steel hammered to them without care for symmetry and a banner on a stick that had once been white. It hung limp and brown now. Their horses were poor, their faces lean. One had a mouth that twisted to the left when he spoke, which gave all his words a sinister hitch. "Brothers of the road," the man said, the words rubbing old grease along old charm. "Have you news? We are dutiful servants of King Joffrey and collect tidings for the crown." Har did not look at Jon. He looked at the man's horse's left hind hoof, as if it might address him. "We have no news," he said. "The marsh keeps its own weather." "News is a tax," the man said. "If you have none, you must pay in other coin." His eyes went to Ghost and measured him less a dog than a thing with teeth. "The beast will do. That's a fine pelt for a cold night." Before he had finished the word night, his voice had altered. It skittered up an octave, as if his throat had discovered suddenly that it belonged to someone else. Ghost did not blur. Ghost did not leap as dogs leap. One moment the dire wolf was at Jon's knee. The next the space between them was full of teeth and white shape and the sound a horse makes when it remembers a wolf from a dream its grandsire had. The bandits' horses broke apart like cards thrown hard on a table, and the men shouted and tried to hold them and could not. Jon did not draw Longclaw. He did not need to. He sat his horse and watched Ghost move through men who thought themselves wolves as if they were reeds in a flooded ditch. No blood, not yet, only fear. Har was suddenly, impossibly, behind their leader, his knife not quite out of its bone sheath, his body still as a plant made of cold. "You might ride on," Har said in his reed voice, "and you might find a farmer with a pig he will give you, or not, or you might try the wolf. A wolf will not give you a pig. He will take your pig and your hands." The man with the twisting mouth looked left and right and could not find a face to read his courage in, and he spat and threw his hand up as if in blessing or surrender, and then they were gone, the limp banner lashing their retreat. "South," Har said when their noise had gone away, as if to remind the day of its business. They did not speak much. The road did that to men, and Har did it also. Jon found himself speaking to Ghost under his breath more than to any man, and if that made him strange, he had long ago made his peace with his strangeness. He found himself thinking of Winterfell without wanting to pierce the thought with a spear of bitterness. He saw in his mind the way the first snow always clung to the apple boughs outside the little door to the service yard, the way the kitchen girls would cover their hair with scarves and laugh in bursts like birds and stamp their feet to keep feeling in them while steam made ghosts of them. He saw Bran's serious face tipped up to watch the crows tilt and roll and fall black into a blacker tree. He saw a girl's slight shape climbing where she shouldn't and a boy's dogged legs learning to ride and a woman's hands that were always doing two things at once. He allowed these things to walk with him and did not beat them away with the stick of what could not be changed. On the 5th day they turned off the road at a place where a tree had fallen long ago and been cut with axes and its trunk left to rot, gray and soft. Har took them down a shallow hollow and along a track that was only a track because he said it was one, and they came to a stream under ice that talked to itself in a higher voice than Jon would have imagined water could have. Their Har folded the day, if folding a day meant making a little journey out of the space between two trees where the snow did not lie, and brought them back to the road without having been seen. "Men who stand with a banner are not the men to be seen by," he said in explanation. "Men who have no banner and do not stand are worse. We'll do the quiet work and the loud work will pass us by." They were not caught again. A ride in winter is a measure of small discomforts rather than one large pain. You peel them away from your skin like the layers of an onion and you never reach the soft, sweet core. Jon's face burned where the cold had touched it and then went to a numbness that felt like a trick. And then the feeling came back in pins. And then he would sleep with his face in his cloak and wake with the smell of his own wool strong in his nose. He was grateful for ordinary things, for the way Hobbs cheese was ordinary and predictable and did not try to be more than it was, for the horse's slow feet under him, for the small fact of a fire that gave a light the color of a warm fruit. Twice they saw vultures wheeling at an edge of the sky where no living thing could be seen. Once they passed the ruins of a house whose stone had fallen in such a way that the hearth still stood like a man who had taken his feet off and refused to sit down. On the 9th day the land began to soften. The snow grew thinner even as the cold kept its bite. The hills lifted and fell in longer breaths. By the 11th day the smell of smoke began to have a flavor. Oats parched in iron pots, dung burned for heat, skin singed clean by surgeons. In the half-light of a late afternoon that had chosen gray as its color and was holding to it stubbornly, Har raised a hand, and Jon saw the tents like a small town scattered along a river's bend, the pennants like scraps of fabric caught in bare branches, the glow of 100 fires through tent cloth. Winter had come to a camp of men and made itself at home, but the camp still had the deeper restlessness of a thing that might have to run at any moment. Har did not walk into it as a stranger might. He moved around it in long, slow curves, reading the edges of a thing like a man tasting a stew by sniffing the steam first. He brought them to a place where sentries stood 3 together, 2 men and a boy, and all 3 in the colors Jon had known since his hand had learned to hold a knife. One man wore the merman of Manderley upon his chest in white and green, the other the flayed man of Bolton, which Jon ignored as a matter of taste. The boy had a strip of gray wool tied at his arm where a proper badge had been meant to go. They had the look of men who had stood in cold too long but would not admit to shifting their feet. "Name yourself," the manderly man said, courtesy rough with wear. Then he saw Ghost, and his breath came out in a sound that might have been laughter had it not been too short. Well, Ghost recognizes his own," Jon said. He drew back his hood and pushed his hair away from his eyes. It felt like stepping out from behind a wall where he had stood for hours. "I am Jon Snow. I ask leave to see Robb Stark." The boy was the first to move. He leaned forward and stared with a pure astonishment that made Jon feel older than he was by years. "It's him," the boy said. "It's the one with the white wolf from Winterfell." He looked embarrassed by his own certainty and tightened the gray strip on his arm, as if remembering he was meant to be a soldier and not a boy. "I mean, it looks like him." The Bolton man's eyes moved like a knife-narrow end to handle along Jon's shape. "Deserter," he said, as one might point to a stone and say stone. "A black cloak with a wolf. I have not seen that before." "I come as an emissary of the Night's Watch," Jon said, and the words were a form of armor he had been given and must wear cleanly. "I carry a letter for Robb Stark sealed by Eddard Stark's hand, delivered by Howland Reed of Greywater Watch." If the names were meant to soften suspicion, they did and did not. The manderly man's face changed, opened. The Bolton stayed as it was but blinked, a slow lizard blink that admitted the possibility of alteration. The boy stared at Ghost so hard that his eyes might have watered if they had any water left in them. "We'll take you to the king," the manderly man said, and then looked embarrassed and amended himself. "To Lord Robb, to the young wolf, to—" He stopped and gestured with his spear. "Come on." They came through the lines as men turned to look, and there was no help for it. Jon felt all the sizes of his life changing around him as if tents could shift their dimensions at will. He was a bastard boy under Winterfell's eaves again. He was a man who had risen with a sword in his hand and taken an oath to a vow older than kings. He was both. Men called to each other and leaned to see and made jokes under their breath and pretended it was nothing. Ghost walked with indifference to all of it, his head level, his tail a pale silence behind him. The main tent was a thing of dark cloth and long stakes that had seen rough use. The snow around it was trampled into a brown slush that made a sound underfoot like sucking teeth. The gray wind that lay outside it lifted his head as they came near and met Ghost's eyes. There was a stillness like a white pool when wind has died on it. Gray wind rose with a slow dignity that bore no likeness to the quickness of a lesser dog. He came forward by inches, reading Ghost as Ghost read him. Their noses touched. The sound that followed was not a growl and not a whine. It was something like a low humming, the nearest a wolf can come to a word. Jon's throat closed against something he could not name. He put his hand on Ghost's shoulders and felt the answering weight across his palm. Once, when they had been boys, he and Robb had pressed their foreheads together and laughed into each other's breath for the simplicity and dumbness of being alive. This was that, in one of its older shapes. A soldier ducked into the tent and emerged a heartbeat later. "He will see you," he said. "Leave your weapons." He glanced at Ghost and thought better of speaking the second half of what he had intended to say. Jon unbuckled Longclaw and laid her across his palms with an unwillingness that was both pride and love. The soldier's eyes went to the bear's head pommel, remembering the Mormont sigil, and then to the steel with a craftsman's quick grasp. He took the sword like a man who knew how to take such a thing, bowed his head a fraction, and stood aside. Har had already taken himself away, like mist when the sun shifts behind a cloud. Jon was alone and not alone. He thought of Maester Aemon's blind eyes and of Jeor Mormont's unwilling concession. He thought of the ink dried to brown. Then he lifted the flap and went in. The tent held the day's mistakes and the day's stubbornness. It smelled of wet wool, clean iron, wax that had dripped and been caught and dripped again, and the sweat of men who had slept and now sat up aggrieved to discover morning. Maps lay across a long table like flayed skins, all lines and named places and the lies between the names. A small brazier burned banked coals, and a kettle hung askew from a hook above the coals and sang a thin, miserable kettle song. Robb stood at the far end of the table with his hands on it, as if he argued with the river drawn there and not the men around it. He had grown older and not older. The tilt of his head when he turned to listen was Eddard's tilt and no one else's. The brightness in his eyes when his gaze lifted to the tent flap was the boy who had dared Jon to climb the bell tower first and then laughed when they both fell into a hay cart and came up sneezing black chaff. "Jon," he said, and there was no space between the name and the body remembered in it. The space closed with a shock in Jon's chest. Robb came around the table in 3 long strides and put his arms around Jon hard, and Jon closed his eyes and felt, for a moment, the absurd luxury of being held by someone who had held him up in a river once and would do it again without question. Then Robb stepped back and hit Jon in the shoulder with a fist he did not pull quite enough. "You're a bastard for not writing." "I wasn't allowed," Jon said and laughed, and the laugh was a stranger to him. He discovered he wanted to use it again and put the wanting away for later. "So I came myself." Behind Robb's shoulder stood men with self-importance arranged on their bodies like armor. "Great, Joe." En Umber's hair seemed to have gotten bigger and his laugh was folded up for now at his belt like a cudgel he would take out if he had to beat sense into a man. Rickard Karstark's face had been carved into sad fury like a statue that could not find the right god to direct its grief to. His eyes were always a little otherwhere. Roose Bolton had brought his own winter into the tent and kept it around him like a fog no one wanted to breathe. His smile was as thin as thread pulled too hard and ready to break. Meage Mormont stood with her arms folded. A woman who would as soon throw you on your back as greet you, and her mouth wore something like a secret that had nothing to do with you. Theon Greyjoy leaned in a careless way that was not careless, his restless fingers tapping the hilt of his dagger as if calling it awake and putting it back to sleep by turns. Catelyn Stark stood just beyond the table, her face composed to a listening that did not grant much. She looked at Jon and looked away, as if a habit of years had reached for her and she had not fought it. Then she looked back, and this time she did not look away. "You come with a message," Robb said, and the warmth that had rushed into his face when he named Jon turned to a kind of rough alertness. "The Black Brothers do not send their wolves only to be seen. Will the wall fall? Is this the thing they have told me I should fear?" "The wall stands," Jon said, and felt the weight of truth in it like a bar across his chest. "But it is winter beyond it in a way that is not a season. The Lord Commander sends me as his emissary. He begs bread and men and iron, and he sends this." He turned slightly and lifted the packet Har had given back to him outside the tent. A small thing, oiled cloth tight, the pale wax seal unbroken. "Howland Reed of Greywater Watch delivered it. It bears Eddard Stark's seal." Catelyn's hand moved a fraction, the kind of movement a woman makes when a flake of ash settles on her sleeve and she would brush it off and cannot because to do so would draw attention to it. Robb stepped forward and reached, and Jon placed the letter in his palm. The wax seal was the direwolf, the same crude press Jon had seen under Mormont's lamp. Robb ran his thumb along its edge once, some instinct wanting to preserve the shape of it even as he must break it. "Maester," he said reflexively, and then stopped, because he was a man in a tent and not a boy in a keep. He broke the seal cleanly, unfolded the parchment, and read. The men in the tent did not breathe while he read. The kettle kept its thin song because no one had told it to stop. The wolves, Ghost at Jon's knee, Grey Wind lying near Robb's foot with his head lifted, made a sound once that was more throat than mouth, and it was a small sound and a whole one. Robb looked up. His face had not changed, which was the only way Jon knew that everything had changed. Robb tended to let his face speak. When he would not let it, the thing that bound them together as boys tugged once and went quiet in Jon's chest, waiting for its next cue. Robb put the letter on the table like a piece of iron he had measured and set aside to be made into something. He then looked past Jon because a man must do the courtesy to the room of wanting them to hear what there is to hear. "It is my father's hand," he said. "It is my father's voice. It says what my father would say, and it says a thing my father would not say to many. It says that his sister Lyanna bore a child to Rhaegar Targaryen and named him in a whisper, and that he, my father, took that child and called him his, and swore to guard him with a lie in his mouth because to do otherwise would kill the boy and perhaps break the realm. Silence again is not all the same. This one had a little shudder in it, like a pond when a fish moves and the rings travel outward without hurry. The Gretchen's mouth opened and shut, and he measured his own urge to roar against something older than his urge. Roose Bolton's eyelids came down and rose as if that were a comment. Catelyn's lips parted, then pressed together as if she could press the years back into place with her mouth. Theon made a sound as if someone had just told him his name meant something more clever than the thing he had always thought. Robb's eyes went to Jon and would not leave him. It says that Jon is that boy. Jon felt none of what men always wrote into songs when the sword comes out of the scabbard and the light strikes just so and some lineage is announced that makes banners rise on their own. He felt that the tent was not large enough to hold the ordinary detail of how men smelled and how his own hands looked and how the kettle was going to boil itself dry if someone did not see to it. He felt relief and shame and anger and a small foolish happiness that could not find a place to sit and so stood up in him like a guest who has arrived too early and will not go away. "He is my father's blood, then," Rickard Karstark said, and the sorrow in his voice held the thought up so that others might circle it and see it from all sides. "He is a Stark of Winterfell in a way that is not the way we used to say it." His eyes moved to Catelyn when he said it, and Catelyn did not move. "He's a Targaryen," Theon said, with a kind of delight in the stubbornness of words. "By the letter of the thing. The dragons get in a wolf's coat. Do we bow then? Do we dye our hair silver and go mad?" Meej Mormont snorted. "I have seen men go mad without any help from their fathers or their hair," she said. "And I have seen men be sons to two things at once and do it without whining. He is what his vow says he is. He is also what his blood says he is. If you want to neat some, you should have stayed in your father's counting house, Greyjoy." "The vow?" Roose Bolton said, pleasant as a finger dipped into honey. "The Night's Watch vows. The boy is bound and cannot inherit, cannot take lordship, cannot wed. He cannot be used. What a pity, to discover a chest of gold with the lid nailed shut." Catelyn found her voice, and it was the voice she used when she was going to tell a story to a child, but had decided the child must hear the story without the softening. "He was never yours to use," she said. "Not when he was a boy on my stairs, not when you were a boy in my hall. Not now you have men call you king to your face when you cannot even keep your boots dry in the snow." The moment she had said it, some other part of her looked at the words and counted them and wished she had kept one or two of them back. She folded her hands over each other and stood as still as she could manage. "But if you are to be king, you must hear this with a king's ears. The truth is a blade without a hilt. If you take it up in your bare hand, you may win your fight and you will bleed for it. The realm does not like truths that make old lies shameful." "My lady," Robb said, not to command quiet but to show that he had heard her and placed her words where they could do their work. He turned to Jon again. "Can you speak?" he asked quietly, the way men ask after a wound. Jon found that he could. "I did not come to ask you for anything," he said. "I came because I had to tell you. If my father wrote this, it was so that you would not be left with only rumors and your own guesses. I am your blood. I am also sworn. I do not mean to, but I will not be a weapon for you. I will not be a flag." "Good," Robb said almost roughly, "because I am tired of weapons and flags that think they are men." He dragged a hand through hair that had not been combed with care for days. "I needed a brother more than I needed a claim," he said, and the words were an admission to himself as much as to any of them. "But I will be foolish if I pretend this thing is small. There are cages and there are keys, and there are men who like to make each other sleep inside one while they hold up the other and argue about who should be released first." "You could forge it into a key," Theon said, ever the boy with a stone in his hand to throw at a window because windows are there to be broken. "If the South will not give you what your father's honor and your sword demand, perhaps they will be more polite to a dragon under a wolf's skin." "The South does not like dragons unless they ride them," Meej Mormont said, "and then only if they ride them at other people. They will not be gladdened to hear the tale." "They will be many things," Roose Bolton murmured. glad not among them, lined up as we are. Stannis, Renly, Joffrey, that crow's son here. His thin smile held for a heartbeat. We could have ourselves a feast of kings that would last the winter. Do not, Catelyn said sharply, and the sound cut the thin humor like a strand. Robb picked up the letter again and read the last lines as if he could make his father alive by reading them in a different order. He could not, and the way his breath left him when he set the letter down the second time was the same way it had left him the first. He looked at Jon without any of the elaborate masks men would later teach him to wear. I wish you were free, he said. I wish I could tell you to go where you like. I wish I had not sent you to the wall in my thoughts when you left. I wish 100 things, but I am glad. He paused and looked at the word and chose it. I am glad to know what I know, even if it is another weight on our table. Ghost pressed against Jon's side again, and Grey Wind's head came to rest near Robb's boot. The two wolves made a low hum, like the sound of wind under a door when all in the house are sleeping. The tent seemed to draw itself nearer around them by an inch. What do we do? Great Jon Umber said finally, unable to bear a quiet that had gone on long enough to begin to itch under his skin. We do something. We are not old women picking bones out of fish and arguing whether there are too many bones or too few. We do nothing loud yet, Catelyn said, and for once even the great Jon did not throw his roar against that counsel. If this is to be a blade, it must be drawn at the right moment, not to impress ourselves with its shine. If this is to be truth, it must be told in a room where the right men are standing and the wrong men are standing outside it. If it is to be love, the word came out as if she had not meant to speak it and found it in her throat nonetheless. Then it must be used as love, not as tool. We gather our strength, Robb said, picking up the thread and making it his before it could fray. We feed our men. We send bread north if we can. We hold. He looked down at the map and was grateful to have a thing under his hands again that did not have breath. We do not step on our own feet. He lifted his head. Jon, will you stay the night? I should go at dawn, Jon said. The Lord Commander expects me back with his answer. He expects me back. He said it twice in the same way men might say a name of a god, and then again when lightning has not struck them for saying it once. But I will stay the night. Then stay at my fire, Robb said. Eat my bread and salt. I can do little enough for you, brother. Let me do the small things a man can do without breaking the world. The big things, his mouth twitched. We will break later if we must. They ate in a smaller tent set aside for meals that did not require lords to talk at the same time they chewed. The bread was good and the soup was of the kind that tastes of many hands having done the simple work together. There is a flavor that comes when peasants and soldiers and the sons of lords put turnips and bits of onion and a handful of barley into the same pot and take them out again by the same ladle. Catelyn watched Jon with a composed attention that did not pretend old things had not happened and did not pretend new things erased them at a stroke. She put a coin of meat in Ghost's mouth and smiled without noticing that she had done it. Theon made 2 jokes that were sharper than he knew, and then he stopped making jokes and drank as if he had something in his throat that only ale could coax to go down. When the bowl had been emptied and the bread gone to crumbs, Robb took Jon to the back of the great tent where the maps lay. He sat on a chest and pulled Jon down to sit on the rug, boys again in a house of men. Tell me everything, he said, impulsive and wholly serious, and Jon did. He told Robb about Maester Aemon's hands on the letter and the way Jeor Mormont had looked at him as if measuring a thing he might not like but would take anyway because it was the only thing he had been offered. He told him of Har's quiet and the way days can be folded along water. He told him of the men on the road who thought themselves tax collectors and were in truth beggars with steel, and how Ghost had made them remember dogs and infant knights. He did not tell him the dream of the harp and the godswood. That was a thing he did not know how to shape with his tongue without making it smaller. Robb told him, between truths he had to hold in his teeth like nails, a small story of Grey Wind learning how to unlatch the latch of a meat chest with his teeth, and of the look on a groom's face when he witnessed that. Between them lay the letter, folded again, even smaller now, as if paper could take its own advice and become less. Sometime in the talk Catelyn stood at the edge and listened as a mother will when her sons talk, always waiting with a hand to lift if one of them should stumble and pretending to be part of the canvas when she is not called upon. When a pause came, she spoke without the preamble of gentle courtesies. "If this comes to light," she said, "there will be those who say that your father betrayed his king and his wife and his house. There will be those who say that you, Robb, would use any means to make yourself what men will call you anyway. There will be those who say that you, Jon, are a prince before you are a brother, and that you stretched out your hand to take what you were not meant to have. None of those are true, but they will be said. You must decide what you say back. Silence is not a shield if the arrows are already in the air." Jon looked at her, and 100 small old angers rose and said their names and sat down again. "What would you have me say, my lady?" he asked, and it was habit that put the clean title on her name. It did not cut as it once had. "You could say nothing," she said. "You could go back to the wall and tell the old blind man there that you did your duty and let the rest go. That would be a bravery as clean as any. Or you could say, 'I will not be used by you,' and then you could endure the men who will use you anyway with their eyes when they do not dare with their hands. Or you could say, 'If there is a thing here that keeps children from being killed for a quarrel grown men cannot end because it would shame them to stop, then I will be that thing, and you could suffer for that because nothing that keeps children from being killed is made without suffering. I am an old woman," she added, which was not true and was, "and I have seen too much to think there is a neat choice. But I will tell you what I would have had my husband do if he had put this letter in my hand instead of sending it where it had to go. I would have had him tell the truth to those who could bear it and bear the cost of that himself, and not hand it to those he loved to pay for it for him." Jon looked down at his hands. They were nicked where a bowstring had raised truth out of skin. The calluses lay in familiar places. He thought of Maester Aemon saying love is... He would not finish the sentence here. He thought, truth is a knife without a hilt. He could not carry it without blood, but he had already bled for old lies. He had bled every time Robb had called him brother, and some part of him had not dared to believe it. He had bled every time Catelyn had looked at him and remembered a hurt he had not caused and a choice he had not made. If he was to bleed for something, better something that might do a work. "I will go back," he said. "I will go back because I said I would and because I have work there that is not finished. But I will not hide the truth from those who must make use of it if it is to be anything but a weight. You will decide, Robb, when to speak and how to speak, and I will go north and keep my vow and hold a sword when the dark comes. If the realm cannot suffer a bastard with a different name, the realm is what it is." Robb laughed once, a sound with no mirth in it and no cruelty either. "The realm is a man with both hands full of eels," he said. "He can keep one from writhing away if he holds too tight, but then the other slithers out, and all the while the eels do what they please. We will count our eels carefully, then." He put his hand on Jon's shoulder and squeezed with the intimacy of boys whose bodies had not yet learned to be men's armor. "Sleep. Tomorrow you ride." Jon lay that night in a tent with Ghost curled against his back, and he did not sleep at once. He lay and listened to the camp breathe, the snores of strangers, the cough of a horse, the small giggle of a man who dreamed and would not remember his dream and would blush for it if he did. He tried to imagine a crown, and his mind refused him the image. He could conjure only iron and leather and the smell of a forge, and Donal Noy's voice telling him that steel does not become a sword until a man takes it in hand and swings it through air that has never been cut that way before. He thought of a dragon, and he saw only a shadow across snow, and then the shadow was a cloud moving over the face of a pool in the Godswood, and the pool did not care. He slept finally as a man sleeps on the eve of leaving, one part always awake in case the world calls his name. At dawn the camp was a field of white breath. Robb stood with gray wind beside the road where it made a brown ribbon through the trampled snow. Catelyn stood with him, her cloak drawn up and the edge of it rimed with frost. Midge Mormont had her hands on her hips and watched with an approval she would not show. Roose Bolton was absent. Theon had drunk too much and looked sullen at his own headache. Great Jon Umber clapped Jon on the back with a blow that would have staggered a lesser man and laughed his laugh for the first time since the truth had entered the tent. A sound as broad as a door being thrown open. "Go on with you, then," he said. "Bring the wall my regards." Tell it that when it and I were boys we would piss on our hands and slap each other's cheeks to see who would shout first. Tell it I have grown older and will not slap any cheek that is not an enemy's now. Tell it the North remembers, and if it forgets, I will throw a stone at its head. I will, Jon said gravely, and the great Jon roared again and went off chuckling to himself about the wall with a bruise on its cheek. Catelyn stepped forward. For a moment it seemed she would say nothing. Then she reached out and did a thing she had never done. She touched his face, just above the cheekbone with the back of her gloved fingers, as if brushing away a hair that had fallen there. I knew your mother once as a girl, she said, catching her breath on the new shape of the truth. I knew her only enough to know she laughed as if there were hot cider in her chest and not blood. I hope, she stopped and changed her mind. I pray there is a world where laughter still has a place. For you, for my son, for the boys you both were and the men you had to be. Go well. Robb embraced him again and then held him as if to keep him was a possibility and then let him go because it was not. Come back, he said, and it was not a command. It was the first plea Jon had ever heard Robb speak. I will. Come back, Jon said. Har was already a shape at the edge of the trees, an angle where a branch had not grown. He waited with the patience of a thing that belongs to a landscape and not to a timetable. Jon mounted and felt the small joy of a good horse under him and the smaller pain of being away from it soon enough. Ghost ran ahead, white and uncatchable. The road bent and bent again and then did not, and the camp became a noise behind them. As Castle Black's shadow grew larger in his mind with each mile north, Jon felt the weight in his breast change, not lessening but settling into a place it might live without tearing. He could not foresee which men would show their teeth when they saw the blade of the truth and which would show their hands. He could not know whether the winter coming would be a name men would say for centuries or one that would be swallowed, like a man in a snowstorm who lies down and becomes a hill. He knew only that there were vows and there were names and there was the space between them, and he had chosen to dwell in that space without shame. On the third day of the return, as the light chose to fail earlier than it had the day before because winter likes to count, and to change the count without telling anyone, Har said, "Listen," and Jon listened. There was no sound at first but their horses' feet and the little cry of a distant bird. Then, under that, a thin singing like metal scratching iron, not near. Har put his palm to the ground and closed his eyes. Men with hobnails, he said. 3, 4. Carrying something hard that hits sometimes against something harder. They are not singing. Their nails are. He led Jon off the road by a track not even a deer would have used and through a clutch of winterberry that had lost its berries to hungrier mouths, and they waited without moving as the men passed. They wore half-mail and red cloth over their shoulders, but the red had gone dull with dirt. They had no banner, and that in itself was a banner. One carried a small chest slung from a pole between two, the pole creaking. One of the men had a face that had been handsome and then had not been. A line of scar pulled his smile to a place where it would have lied if he had tried to use it. They walked as if they owned the day under their feet and had no opinion about the night. They did not see Jon and Har in the winterberry. They passed on, and the singing of the nails faded. Do you want to know what is in their box? Har asked practical. No, Jon said. He did not want to open one more thing that made truth come out and make him bleed. We cannot keep all the wolves from all the doors. We can only keep the door that is ours. He had not known he believed this until he said it, and saying it did not make it more true than it had been. It made it more his. The air smelled different on the day the wall came into sight again. It always did. The cold there was older, more saturated, as if the air had forgotten what other things might be besides winter and needed to be told again. Jon felt a relief that had nothing to do with comfort. The black line of men along white ice was a homely line, and his body recognized home in a way his mind had not allowed itself to. Ghost raised his head and howled a note that made the very idea of a house stir in Jon's chest. Jeor Mormont listened to Jon's report standing and did not sit down while he did. Maester Aemon sat with his hands folded in his lap, listening with the humility of a man who knows the world will be what it will be whether he listens or not, and listens anyway because that is the work of being alive. Har curled himself into a place near the hearth and seemed to vanish slightly, as if he had folded himself along with the day and would unfold only when water asked him to. "They will send bread," Jon said, a truer promise than any other, because the North would always send bread if it had it. "They will send men if they can. They will send word." Robb reads the letter. He knows. He did not say aloud what else he had seen. He did not say the way the room had tilted when a truth put its hand under it and lifted. He did not say Catelyn's gloved touch or Robb's laugh or the Grachan's door. He did not need to. The old man knew something by the sound of Jon's breath more than by the words. Eamon knew much by the silence between words. Mormont grunted and turned to the window where the slit of a sky could be seen without the cold being allowed to stride in. "Kings and claims," he said. "We are not merchants of them, and yet we deal with them. Fine, fine. I have a letter for your boy king in return for his. I will make it sharper now that I have your words. We will see whether he sends bread and men and iron or only words like the rest." He looked at Jon then, hard and not unkind. "You came back." "I came back," Jon said, and the satisfaction that came with the word surprised him. He had done a thing he had said he would do, and the world had not broken where he stepped. That was a small joy, and he would keep it. He went out into the yard and stood with Ghost to look at the pale northern sky making a clean sound over the battlements. PYP shouted to Gren and missed catching the ball they threw with gloved hands. It thudded into the snow, and PYP swore with relish the way a man swears at a friend and not at fate. Sam huffed up beside Jon with his cheeks raw and his eyes alight as if the cold lived there without hurting him. "Did you bring me a feather?" he asked, shy and bold together. Jon reached into his cloak. He had not meant to, and yet somehow a white feather lay there, long and a little bent at the tip, caught from Ghost's coat where it had brushed past a goose in some camp where geese had lived once and left their trace in straw. He held it out. "From the Riverlands," he said, not lying, because a thing from a man's memory is as much from a place as the stone in a pocket is. Sam took it and smoothed it and looked as if he had been given a key to a house he had dreamed of. At dusk, Jon went to the top of the wall again and stood where he had stood nights ago when the world had not yet changed its name. The wind was the same or near enough. The ice breathed. Ghost sat and looked north, and Jon looked with him. Somewhere down the King's Road a truth was walking through tents and halls and across dirty rushes and under banners, and men were choosing whether to look at it or at their own hands. The war would not end because of it. It might bend by a degree. The others would not be moved by the name of Targaryen. The dead did not read letters, but living men did, and living men were the ones who chose where to stand when the dead came. Jon placed his palm on the ice and felt its old stillness and its old inward river move. He had a father. He had always had one. He had two. He had made a vow. He had kept it this one time. He would keep it again because there was no other thing to do that was not a lie. He felt the letter's weight still, although it was no longer in his hand, and he did not try to set it down. Some weights are not for setting down. They are for learning the gait that carries them. He blew his breath out and watched it go, briefly visible and then gone, and he thought, without knowing he had thought it until he heard it, that the breath of a man is like a tale told in winter. You can see it, you cannot hold it, but you are warmer for it being there. He stood a while longer, a black figure on white, and then he went down to where the men laughed and swore and held bowls out to be filled, to do the work that made all the other works possible, and to wait for the sound of a horn. Snow gave back the day in a quiet way the world south of the wall never learned. It did not glint or shout. It offered a softened, faithful light, as if reminding men that brightness and noise were not the same thing. The yard had been beaten level by boots and brooms until it seemed the color of salt rubbed into old wood. Men moved there like figures in a picture a child has made with a blunt charcoal, all blacks and grays and blotted faces, and the sound was wool against wool, leather against leather, steel once and sometimes twice when hands forgot to mind their own cold. Jon stood with a bow in his hand and let the string find the place in his fingers where it wanted to live. The pull set a line down his back that felt like a truth spoken without bravado. Ghost watched the straw target with apparent contempt, as wolves do when men pretend at hunting inside fences. The arrow's flight was small and clean. It made a sound like a breath drawn and not released. He loosed a second and a third, and then lowered the bow and rubbed oil into the string the way Donal Noy had bid him. The cold took whatever a man did not tend. Men, strings, promises. "Your face looks different," PYP told him later, offering a tin cup that had been hot long enough ago to remember it fondly. "Not better," he added, quick and cheerful. "Just different. Like a boy who's found an extra room in his own head and doesn't know what the devil to put in it." "Spare jests," Jon said, and drank, the scrape of the tin a comfort against his teeth. "Or a feather for Sam." "I'm collecting those," Sam said, appearing from the lee of the kitchen with a bundle of ledgers that wanted to fall. He had folded the white feather Jon had given him into a narrow strip and hidden it in the seam of his glove where he could rub it with his thumb and pretend he was not doing any such thing. "You don't have to bring any more." He told no one in particular, which was the same as telling Jon and telling the gods both. One is as much as many, if you look at it the right way. It was an ordinary morning such as a man could live a lifetime inside if he did not stir for something that hurt to be stirred for. It yielded to a noon that tasted of iron and a thin broth, and then to a dusk that held its breath as it always did along the wall, as if night were a guest the day knew was coming and was not sure it wished to see. A raven came with it, a black bolt from a grayer sky, dropping like a stone and then remembering wings at the last moment. It struck the perch outside the rookery with such force that the wood shook and Hobb swore at a stew that had done nothing to deserve it. Bowen Marsh met Jon on the steps with the face of a man who had miscounted sacks and was determined to find the missing flower in someone's hands. "For the Lord Commander," he said, as if Jon might tuck the bird under his arm and claim it, and climbed on without waiting. Jon admired him for that, at least, his predictability. In a world that kept shifting under him, a man who would always sound the same when he was displeased was a kind of anchor, even if you never wished to tie your boat to it. Jeor Mormont cracked the seal of Robb's reply with his thumbnail, as if he would have preferred to use a tooth. The letter left a stain of red wax on his thumb, a small, ridiculous wound. He read with the impatience of a man who had once read for pleasure and had educated himself out of such indulgences. "Bread," he muttered, and some of the lines in his face loosened, not with softness but with the relief of a problem put into numbers. "Salt fish, barley, peas. Nails enough to remind us we own hammers." His eyes moved faster. The page made a dry flit against itself as he shifted the weight between his hands. "Men if he can spare them. He cannot, so he says it twice that he will try." He snorted. "He tells me that if my men are thieves they had best steal quickly, for the Riverlands will get there first. He tells me, Lord Commander?" Eamon, Mormont's mouth thinned. "He tells me he has news that is not for ravens, and then he does not write it. Your boy is learning how to keep 2 fires burning without setting the hall on fire." He folded the letter and tapped it once against his knuckles. "He sends word that he has sent word elsewhere. A king in the south and a green one both. He will be measured by men who weigh on different scales than the ones we keep." He lifted his head and saw Jon as if for the first time, though Jon had stood there since the wax broke. "He says to tell Jon Snow that he keeps a place for him beside his fire if he ever has a fire and a room that isn't made of canvas." "I will have to bring my own stool," Jon said, and Mormont grunted again, unwilling to call that a jest and unwilling to be seen enjoying it. "Bread," the old bear repeated, "more to the room than to any man. We will speak less like beggars when we chew more like men. Bowen, take 3 carts and the good oxen. Send Thorn if he thinks he knows his way to a counting house." "No." His lip curled as if the taste of a name were bad beer. "Send Others' old team. They won't break a trace when nailed to it." He waved the rest away like smoke and turned to Eamon. "Write him, thank him, ask him for men again without pleading. Remind him he has friends on the wall and enemies beyond it who don't care what surname his messenger carries." Eamon's blind eyes softened, as they always did when the talk turned to letters. There was a light in writing that he could see better than other men. "I will ask him for candles too," he said. "Bread makes men march. Candles make them see what they're marching toward. We have oil and wicks, but a man needs the kindness of wax in winter." Later, in the rookery, the ravens made their old talk, black heads cocked, eyes like beads dipped in winter. Aemon's fingers moved through feathers with the patience of a priest smelling incense. "He was a good man," he said without naming who he meant, which was the only way to speak of the dead that was not a kind of theft. "He thought too much and not enough. That is the danger of good men. They make bridges with their minds that their bodies cannot cross." "Rhaegar," Jon said, and the name entered the cold room like a warmer draft that did not last and left a memory that did. "Was he as they say?" "They say many things," Aemon said. "He read more than he jousted. He listened more than he commanded. Men love a prince that seems to stand beside them at the fire. They love less a prince who has his ear turned toward a song only he can hear. He wanted to be a song, and the world asked him to be a shield." He lifted a raven's claw and examined the nail as if it might have written a letter when no one was looking. "We suffer for the songs we believe we are. So did he. So will you if you are careless." "I am not a song," Jon said, the words flat and stubborn as men in the north are taught to be. "I have a sword and a cloak and a wall to watch. If there is music, it is in other men's throats. I have been alive long enough to know that music does not always ask permission," Aemon murmured. "You will still choose your steps. That is your honor. But there is something in you that will gather sound. Be careful what you make of it." Jon could not think of an answer that did not feel like a boy's answer to an old man who had carried too many winters. He stroked the glossy neck of a raven whose beak had a nick in it and thought of a harp in a dream he would not tell. When he left the rookery, the wind took the edges of his cloak as if to remind him of the shape of his body and what it was good for. The knights gathered in their old manner. One brought wind like a knife. Another brought stillness and a sky that seemed too large. A third brought the strange blue that comes after heavy cloud when snow holds its breath but does not fall. The wights in their casks remembered their business. The memory spread like rot in bad wood until the whole watch grew restless. One rose in the dark outside his own bindings with blue in his eyes and no poetry in him, only hunger. Men who had laughed at tales burned him and did not laugh anymore. Jeor Mormont's patience thinned to raw hide and then thickened again because there was nothing else to do but thicken. When the order came, it came without show. "We go," Mormont said, as if he were setting a bowl on a table. The words went around the yard on the wind and took their own places in men's mouths. The great ranging would be a big word to hang around any man's neck. The men who went out would have to lift it by inches without expecting anyone to clap. Sledges were loaded and reloaded. Packs were shouldered and unpacked and packed again. The mules stood with their dozy patience and chewed, unfussed at the great business men made of leaving. Donal Noy banged a set of rivets into a link and swore without heat. Hob cut meat into squares you could measure a morning by. "Will you be all right?" Sam asked, which was a foolish question and not the way questions asked by friends often are. He stood with one mitten caught up under his armpit where he had stuck it to keep a page open, and his hair had decided to make a crown of itself under his hat. "I mean, of course you will, with Ghost and with you, but still. I'll be where most of the men with their mouths open are," Jon said, smiling. "If I fall into a hole and don't come out, sing. Singing keeps men from pretending holes aren't there." "I don't sing well," Sam confessed, brave in the least of ways and by that the bravest. "But I'll try." They went out under a dawn that had not decided whether to show its face. Lines of black in a white land, they seemed at first as thin as quill marks on a clean page. The farther they went, the thicker they grew. Men make their own weather, and it gathered around them in steaming flares as breath and effort and the grunts of mules and the little collapses of snow underweight. Ghost ran ahead and vanishing and reappearing like a thought half had and then lost, sometimes close, sometimes at the edge of sight where the land met the old sky. When he was close enough, Jon felt him like a stone in his palm, with weight and shape and meaning. When he was far, Jon felt a stretch in himself, the tautness a bow knows. Forests came and went like old men at feast days, some stooped and close, some thinned and letting men pass without comment. The rivers they crossed had forgotten their names under ice. Only the hum showed where water remembered being water. At night the fire Har had taught Jon to make. A low one, a winter bed, coals like buried eyes, did its quiet work. Men played at dice and did not quarrel too much. Dolorous Ed said something like a prayer to misery and found a way to make it comic without making it smaller. Ghost slept with his nose on his paws and opened one eye when the wind did something a wolf would take note of. Craster's keep sat like a bad tooth in a jaw, sound enough to chew, infected enough to make eating a thing you did under protest. The smell reached them first, not the honest stink of men and beasts and heat, but a sourness that clung to wood. The man himself came out in furs, a stub of a man with eyes that went to every woman and then to every weapon and then to every woman again, as if his mind only had 2 rooms and the door swung the same way every time. "You crows," he said, not wasting more honorific than he had to. "You've come to take my food and ask me who I sleep with." He spat. "I keep my commandments. I give the boy children back to the cold. That's more than most do. The girls stay on because girls stay on. Your business is out there." He jerked his thumb at the dark. Jeor Mormont swallowed the insult as a man swallows gristle because the stew is otherwise good and he is hungry. "We'll take what you can spare and give what we can afford," he said, and the bargain went in as both had known it would. The girls moved around them like shadows that had learned to breathe. One had eyes like blue glass that had been left in a stream. Bed, you could look through them and see the stones beyond. Another had a belly that declared what had been done to her. She carried it with the grim dignity of a woman who knows what men will and will not do and has measured her choices nonetheless. Gilly had a small face and large hands and a tremble in her lip that had nothing girlish in it. It came from an older part of the body, the part that remembers being prey. Sam saw her and was a boy again and a man at the same time, like a child wearing his father's boots that were too large and would be his someday whether he wanted them or not. He whispered to Jon what he would have shouted in a better world. "We can't leave her," he said. "We can't leave any of them. But if we cannot save all, maybe we can one." He looked at his own hands as if to ask them what they were good for besides holding quills and dropping cups. Jon's stomach made the old twist that always came when a man was asked to do a good thing that would break a dozen other things just as good. "If I could carry them all I would," he said. "If I could carry one, I would. But there's the old bear's word, and there's the law of this place, and there's the winter that will kill a girl as easily as a white if we take her out without the men to guard her. We do not have enough men to guard ourselves as it is." He hated the taste of the words. He spoke them anyway. "We have to come back with an army or with a summer. I have neither in my pocket." Gilly looked at him once, and whatever she saw there made her stop pleading with her eyes. She did not forgive him. She accepted him, which was colder and cleaner and harder to bear. The night before they left Craster's, Ghost stood and went to the edge of the clearing where the rotten ice had made a lacework over a ditch. He lifted his head and breathed a slow note that was not a howl and not a whine. Jon went and put his hand in the fur at his shoulder and looked where Ghost looked. There was nothing to see, which was the same as something when a wolf told you there was. He stood until his toes lost feeling and then stood a while longer. When he slept, his dream was the old godswood with a pale trunk and red leaves that fell without wind and a reflection that was not his own in the pool. The man in the water had hair like a raven wing where the light had not faded it and a tired mouth. He put his hand to the water and did not break it. The sound in the dream was of a harp, strings plucked as if not to wake anyone, and the song did not ask for him. It went on by itself and did not mind his listening. The shadow tower sent down Qhorin Halfhand like a blade a man had put away because he was not ready to cut and then found he needed after all. He was winter's economy made flesh. Nothing spare on him, nothing wasted. The hand that gave him his name was gone. The one that remained could hold a man's attention as if it were a hilt. He looked at Jon once and then again as two men might measure a distance without saying so. "You have a wolf that keeps his own counsel," he said, not as praise or censure. but as a man might note that a stream will not carry a log unless it is made to. He listens better than any man, Jon said. Most wolves do, Qhorin said, and in that he put his opinion of men. The half-hand spoke low to Mormont over a map scratched into snow with a stick. Lines where there were no lines. Borders men believed in and others that the dead kept. Mance has them moving, he said. Little hills shudder when wildlings run over them. They go north into the true cold and then west to slide down behind us, some of them, and others go to where the mountains hold wind like an old jug. I'll take a handful along Skirling Pass and listen. Maybe I'll find a mouth that will tell me the truth to feel important, and I'll leave him with the importance and take the truth. His eyes slid once to Jon and did not linger. I'll take your wolf boy with me, he said. Mormont bristled, and his beard seemed to do it for him, each hair a soldier. He's not a boy. He's worse. A man with a boy's sense of how little he should care whether he's alive tomorrow. He cares enough, Qhorin said. He knows how to stand still. He knows how to let silence work. He knows how to hold his face when men say what they think they want to hide. And he has that. He tilted his chin at Ghost, who had decided that the half-hand was not bad, which was not the same as deciding he was good. Mormont's gripe was the old gripe of a man who had too few to spend and a purse with holes in it. He grunted and nodded and then took Jon aside. If you go and die, I'll have to send another. If you go and live, you'll bring me something I can use besides stories of trees. He paused and his eyes softened a little, which was never pretty on his face. Be what you are, he said. Not what any letter says you might be. That's for some other day. For this day, be a crow with a good pair of ears. They went. The world up along the pass was not a thing for men. It was a thing that had been before men and would be after. The mountains like old gods whose faces no longer resembled faces and did not care to. Snow there had a different voice. It squeaked sometimes, and sometimes it sighed, and sometimes it said nothing at all when it should have, and those were the worst places to put your foot. The wind came in clever little hands that took heat from the wrists, from the hollow under the collarbone, from the narrow of the back where a man forgets he has skin. Qhorin and his men were careful. Carefulness was as close to piety as any of them needed. They found wildlings by finding absence first. No birds where there should have been two. Silence where a drift had been cut by a body that had gone past and not covered its work. A bit of leather thong where no honest thong would snap by itself. Qhorin set them in a half circle and they closed it, and the trap was a trap because men are men and do not lift their eyes until a noise makes them. The wildlings fought like men who had only ever been taught to fight by wanting to live. Jon admired them as he would a knife made from bad metal and used safely anyway. One girl's hair was the color of rust in an old sword. She laughed with her mouth shut as if not to waste the warmth. She ran when the half-hand told Jon to bring her in alive. He did not kill her because his hand did not lift that way. She turned at the last and held a knife in a way that said she would cut him if he let her. He disarmed her by catching her wrist and twisting it until the knife fell in the snow and looked relieved to be out of the world. Her breath came hard. She looked at him like a woman measuring a gate and deciding whether to climb it or lie down and pretend it is not there. "What are you?" she asked. "A lord's get playing at crows?" "I am a crow," he said. He did not answer the rest. He did not know how. She smiled a little as if she had received an answer and then did not. They bound her hands with a strip of hide that had once been a boot thong. It smelled of a man's foot and not pleasantly. She bore it without complaint, perhaps because complaining wastes breath. At night she told them lies because truth is a coin you do not hand strangers, and because lies are warmer and fit in the mouth easier. Jon listened and did not argue. He learned the shapes of the lies and liked them as a man likes a tune he knows and can hum without thinking. She watched him as if tasting the watchfulness itself. In the dark, the wind pushed the tent cloth with so many small fingers that it seemed the night wanted to come in and sit by the fire and tell its own story. Qhorin taught Jon a thing or two about not looking away when the part of the world that is not a face looks back. Men tell on themselves most when they think they are talking about the weather, he said, which was meant to be a jest and was not. And never give all of yourself to any of them. They don't have the teeth for it. When the Halfhand sent 2 of their small company down an eastern side to see whether the snow kept its own counsel, Jon felt the moment before it came. It entered him the way cold enters, not at the skin but under it, and then his skin noticed later. Ghost lifted his head and flattened his ears and put his body near Jon's leg. The arrow that came first took the man beside Jon through the meat of his shoulder. The sound he made was the human sound of a man surprised to find he has a hole where his breath goes and something else inside it too. The next arrow went past Jon's cheek with a whisper only a man with the face he now owned could hear. It took a lock of hair it had not asked for and left behind a new piece of air. Qhorin did not shout. He breathed one sharp syllable that was not a word and made men go where they should have gone anyway. They slipped under stone as if it had been carved for them by a blacksmith who knew them. Ghost ran, which was the same as not being seen. The girl lay flat without needing to be told. Some lives are made of ducking. They waited and counted arrows. Waiting is as much a weapon as the thing you hold in your hand. When the shooting slowed because men hate to part with the last of anything, Qhorin had them come up like grass after frost. The fight after was small and stupid and close. Men in a white world putting red on it where it had not planned for it. Jon's sword work was adequate and lucky the way most sword work that does not kill you is. He took a blow on his forearm that he would feel when he was an old man if he got that far and gave one back that cut a man's leather and part of his pride and maybe nothing else. The Halfhand did not look like much doing it. He looked like a man chopping wood. 1, 2, 3, and then no more wood. When the white stopped being marked with new red, he counted the breathing and the not breathing, and then he went on counting as if numbers might become a prayer if you made enough of them in the right order. They moved again before the light could decide who owned the day. Jon took the girl along because she was there and because the Halfhand had told him to, and those 2 orders were the same weight in his head for now. When she stumbled, he took her elbow and regretted it because her body was the same as any girl's body under furs, and that knowledge had no place to live up here. She saw the regret and smiled a little, and that had no place either and lived nonetheless. They did not get as far as they had meant to by noon. The land did not think much of their intentions and had its own. They ate standing, which is the way men tell themselves they are not stopping. The girl looked at the food with hunger that had manners. "Give me a name," Jon said finally, "because men need names to wrap their minds around. If it's not yours, give me one you like." "Ygritte," she said, and he could not tell if it was the truth or a tune she liked. "And you are Snow," she added, contempt tucked into the syllable the way a cook tucks herbs under meat. "Jon," he said, and left her to make of it what she would. Elsewhere, while the mountains counted men, the riverlands counted banners. A boy who had a crown because men could not agree on their father's crowns stood in a tent and tasted the inside of a word he did not like. The world had fewer warm places than it had once had, and he felt he had paid for each one shut to him. Catelyn watched her son the way a woman watches a door that sticks. She could put her shoulder to it if she must, but if it were to open on its own she would be the happiest. Yet she knows in her bones it will not open on its own anymore. Roose Bolton said little and meant less. Meage Mormont sharpened a knife that did not need it and smiled without teeth at men who thought they had learned to be afraid of women. Theon Greyjoy put his hands into and out of his belt as if he were trying to find a way to put them somewhere that would not betray him. That night Theon sat with a scrap of parchment and a bit of charcoal and wrote "I am your son" to a man who cared more for salt than sons. He stared at the words until they turned sideways and meant nothing. Then he rubbed them out with the heel of his hand and left a smear that looked like a bruise. He started again. "Robb needs ships." He had written that before, and it had not made anything nicer for anyone. He tried, "He trusts me," and that was worse, and he wiped at it with the same hand and made the bruise darker. The letter he finally sent was the letter any clever boy would send to a father who thought cleverness in boys an insult. Respect and a promise to bring what another man could not. He signed it Theon, which was the only honest part of it. If he thought of Jon, he pushed the thought aside, because to think of a bastard who was not a bastard made something tender in his chest he could not afford to carry to sea. The wind off Dragonstone smelled of ash and old salt and secrets. Its lord stood with his jaw set in its stubborn place and listened to a woman who had made a practice of standing near fires as if they were her parish. Her red cloth drank light. Her eyes had a candle's patience. "The cold moves," she told Stannis Baratheon. "It moves like a slow tide, and the time will come when men look south for heat and find only you and your fire." She did not say more names than she had to. She pointed instead with her words. "There is a boy on the wall whose blood is a coin that buys great things. He does not know what he is, and that makes him dangerous. The night knows. It has counted him." Davos stood by and wanted to cover the fire as one covers a bowl of stew, for fear somebody will spit in it if they see it uncovered. He doubted and did not hide the doubting in his face because he had served too long at sea to start learning to lie on land. Stannis did not answer. Stannis was a man who believed that answers were sometimes a kind of surrender. He stared into the flames and saw what he saw and told no one, which in its way was a kind of faith. In King's Landing, a man in soft shoes walked over stone that had felt too many hard boots. He listened more than he spoke. When he spoke, it was to set air in motion in such a way that other men's words would settle where he needed them to. The rumor that came to him about a dragon-blooded boy in the north had the look of a fish other fish had already bitten. He turned it over in his hands and did not show anyone the wound marks. The queen laughed when someone told her. It was a hard sound like glass striking glass. She sent for wine. In Harrenhal, a cold-eyed lord turned the same rumor over like a coin and asked himself whether it would buy a cup of anything. He decided it would later when men were thirsty and put it in his purse with the others. None of that helped Jon breathe on the mountain, but the world has never coordinated its kindness well. He breathed anyway and learned how to use his sleeve to keep his lips from cracking and how to sleep without fully sleeping because that was what Qhorin Halfhand's company had to do if they were to be awake when they must. The girl learned to talk less and watch more, which made her dangerous in a different way. She smiled sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking. He saw and pretended not to because noticing is a kind of gift and you do not give gifts to captives. It was Ghost who found the place, as had ever been the way of it when the world meant to be generous without admitting it. The dire wolf stopped in a ring of old stones that had once been put there by hands that had not thought of themselves as men's hands but only as hands because there had been nothing else to compare to. The stones leaned as old teeth lean. The snow within the ring lay differently, as if it had made a pact with something under it. Ghost began to dig, not with frantic greed but with a steady purpose that moved snow without making much of a mess. Jon knelt and pushed with his hands, and where the snow was thin he found old drift and then skin, hard and oiled and cracked with the kind of cracking that comes when a thing has been dry a long time and kept dry. Inside were arrowheads dark as night where it touches fire. Dragonglass, men named it, and children were afraid of it for no good reason and for the best reason of all. There was a small horn too, plain, with a crack Jon's thumb found at once. He did not blow it. Even a boy knows better than to put his mouth to a thing whose purpose he cannot name. He brought the cash to Qhorin and let the Halfhand make of it what he would. "Old as a broken promise," Qhorin said, turning an arrowhead so that it threw back a bloodless light. "Useful. Keep it with the man who will remember he has it when the day comes he needs it." He closed Jon's fingers around 3 of the points and the weight of the horn and did not say anything that might be taken for a blessing or a curse. They were still turning over the luck of that find when the ravens grew restless without reason and the snow changed its mind in the late afternoon and began to fall without breeze. Straight down, soundless, indifferent. The world went small very quickly. Men learned again how to be close to each other without learning anything about each other. Qhorin moved among them like a shepherd with wolves instead of sheep, which is to say he did not call and have them come. He went to where they were and set his hand on the shoulder or the back of a neck and made his will clear without speech. Ghost was suddenly there and then not. His fur took snow and did not keep it. It fell from him as water falls from a well-made cloak. On the 8th night out from Mormont, when exhaustion had become a layer of clothing men forgot they had on, the horn came. It was not the horn Jon had found. It was the old call that had held the watch together for hundreds of winters because men are, in the end, animals and respond to sounds in their blood even if they disagree about banners. One blast. It means friends, his muscles remembered before his mind did. The sound went up the spine like heat and out into the cold again. 2 blasts. Wildlings, said something older than speech in him, and Ghost rose without changing shape. The third blast did not come. It would. It had somewhere at some time. It had once, long ago, in a tale, in a brag made at a fire by a man whose hair had been singed off. It did not now. Men ran to their posts. The girl darted like a fox to the shadow of a tall stone and pulled her hands around to the front without anyone seeming to show her how to do it. Jon saw and did nothing. He placed his palm on the dragonglass as if to warm it and felt no warmth in it at all. The wildlings who came at them had hunger and courage and a poor opinion of dying. Qhorin's men had practice and a fair hand with short spears and the knowledge that the mountain did not care who fell where. The skirmish went the way of small skirmishes that do not have a poet to write them up into songs. There was sharp breath and stumblings and a bright spurt or two, and then the new quiet of men who would not get up and the old quiet of the mountain reasserting its superiority. Jon found his own breathing and listened to it. It was as good a prayer as any he had. In the aftermath, with the wind deciding whether to get up and do something about the way men had disturbed its floor, Ygritte stood looking at the ground as if it had insulted her. Her hands were free because leaving them bound was pointless. She had learned to carry the thong like jewelry. "If you kill me now," she said to Jon finally, because men expect that after battles. "Do it because you need to and not because someone told you to." "I am not going to kill you," Jon said. He was tired enough to speak like himself. "Then you're a fool," she said, "and I like you for it." He turned away because he had no room in him for liking in any direction tonight. The Halfhand's shadow fell long, and Jon remembered suddenly the way Robb's hands had felt when they gripped his shoulders, boy strong and king uncertain, and the warmth of the tent and the smell of soup and the sound of gray wind's breath. The thought steadied him and hurt him equally. Elsewhere, the boy who had held him stood over a map that had grown creases like an old woman's palm. He traced a line along a river with a finger he did not recognize as his and said a name he did not know would be a mistake until after he had said it. He named Theon as messenger and called him brother because he had called him that when they were boys and had not taught his mouth new manners. Catelyn watched and made a sound deep in her throat that was like the opening of a chest that has rusted shut. Roose Bolton said nothing and thought many things, as was his custom. Ghost put his nose into Jon's hand and pressed hard, as if to remind him which parts of the world were still made of flesh and not maps. He let the weight of the direwolf's head rest there until his wrist ached, and then he moved, because a man must. It went on like that for days that stacked on each other like logs, each slightly different length, each having to be placed just so if the pile were not to fall. Qhorin sent 2 men back along a track that only men with their faces turned north and their hearts turned north could have seen, with a muttered instruction that sounded like winter when it speaks sense. If you can be quicker than the man who wants to kill you, be. If you cannot, be quieter. Jon lay in snow deep enough to make a new body for him and watched a line of wildlings pass under his eyes as fish pass under ice. Shadows, and then faces when the ice is thin. He saw men and women both and children who had learned not to cry and old men who had learned not to sigh. He did not hate them. He did not know yet how to help them either. After a week, the mountain gave them back to the world as if bored, and they slipped down to where trees remembered their own names. Qhorin said they would turn north and cut the edge of a camp they had smelled but not seen and make sense of it. His men nodded with their mouths closed. Jon's arm throbbed where the arrow's kiss had left a bruise under the skin without breaking it. The flesh had the hot, taffy-stretched feel of something that wanted his attention and did not deserve it. Night, when it came, wore a peculiar stillness. It sat down heavily, like an old aunt at a table where boys are trying to gamble without being seen. The stars that showed had a harsh steel clarity, as if they had been filed clean this afternoon by a careful god. The fire they dared was mean and blue as a prisoner. It still made a circle in the dark that men would cluster around as chickens will, without thinking. Jon lay with Ghost's warmth along his shins and told himself the names of trees he could not see. Birch, alder, pine, because to call things wrong in the dark was to invite a different sort of night. He slept, and the dream was no longer the god's wood. It was a hall, long and bright in a tired way, rushes on the floor, the high table empty, torches guttering with an orange patience. He walked between benches and heard the sound of a harp at the far end, very soft, chords plucked by fingers that did not rush. He knew without knowing how that, if he reached the dais, he would see a man with hair like his and eyes that had read too many books. He did not go. He stood in the middle of the hall and let the song come to him, and when he woke he carried the last notes a little while on his tongue like a taste. The dawn that followed broke without show, cloud the color of old bone, light like the underside of a fish. Before men could decide whether to be grateful for that or not, the horn went on the far side of the encampment. One blast, then a second, stacked on it, the sound whitening the air as frost whitens breath. Men stood into themselves. Qhorin looked at Jon and did not have time to say anything he might have said. He gestured once, meaning hold here and go there and send this and wait for that, and that was enough. Jon found his place the way a knife finds its sheath in the dark by long practice. The wildlings did not come stupidly this time. They came with fire at the front and arrows behind, and they made the water boil without heat by running men along its skin until it seemed more alive than it had a right to be. Ghost shape moved through smoke like a piece of smoke that had decided to have teeth. Jon's arm did the work it had been taught. The dragonglass lay in his pouch, a comfort and a question and not yet a tool. Ygritte shouted something that might have been a warning or a curse. Her voice had the rough music of stone underwater. They held. Holding is not a song sung to make men feel full of themselves. It is a tired chant, a counting of breaths, a stubbornness. They held until the wildlings withdrew because there was nothing in the holding worth dying for. After men went down without meaning to, all the hardness gone out of their legs like soup thrown on snow, Qhorin moved among them and said, "Good," as if he were judging the hardness of a loaf. He allowed them a little stew and a little sleep and then put them on their feet, because to be tired on your feet is better than to be rested lying down when the world will not allow it. Back at the wall, the men who had not gone out kept their own promises with their own disciplines, which did not look like much and were all the world. They mended and hauled and cursed and laughed and found ways to be wrong that would not kill them and corrected those ways. A train of carts came in with barley and fish and nails, and men who would be men again after they had eaten twice and slept once. A letter came with them addressed to the Lord Commander, and another in a smaller hand addressed to Jon. And Sam brought it to him with the shame of a boy with a secret treat he had had to hold for too long. Jon took the letter to the little place behind the old stores where a man could be alone long enough to forgive himself for being someone men needed. He broke the seal without looking at it, because looking would have made him someone else for a moment. The hand was Robb's, and the words were a brother's trying not to be a king's. He told Jon little, which told Jon much. He said the bread had been sent and the promises made. He said Theon had gone to Pike because men are made stupid by love and wiser by loyalty, and it is a terrible thing life asks that they choose one. He said their mother prayed without the September and that it felt like a new sin and an old kindness. He said keep the truth as we agreed, and that he trusted Jon without any explanation of what trust meant, and that he would never put the word king between them if he could help it. He did not ask Jon to come back. He told him to come back, and the order was a mercy because pleas are heavier than commands. Jon folded the letter until it was as small as it would go and tucked it into a seam in his boot where it would ride with him as long as he had the leather and the foot. He stood a while and let himself feel the boy he had been, and then, because men cannot live in that part of themselves, he put the feeling away without throwing it away. Night again. Fires like small mouths eating discreetly. The sky opened for a little while, and a star or two came out as if to see what men were about. Jon lay with Ghost's spine against his calf and let his breath go out until it matched the breath of the men around him, because there is a comfort in not being the only chest rising and falling in the dark. He listened for a horn that did not sound, and for a song that did, and for the slow old calling of the ice to itself, which is as close to prayer as the north cares to make. When the third blast came at last, it was not on his mountain or in his tent. It came elsewhere, to other ears, in a night that had thought itself safe. Men who had mocked the old counts forgot the shapes their mouths made and stood up with their thoughts halfway dressed. It did not come again immediately. 1 comes to mean brothers, 2 the free folk, 3 the others, the oldest tale and the newest news. On the mountain, Jon slept through it and woke with a sense of something different in the day and could not name what. His naming would come. It always does, late or early. In some tent, A horn lay cracked and unused, and some man's lips would never touch it. In another, a horn lifted and shook the night and made even the dead listen. The world set its pieces. Not neatly, not kind, but it set them. Jon stood in the bleak light and sharpened Longclaw just enough, not so much that the steel grew thin. A man can love a thing into uselessness if he is not careful. Ghost licked at the snow where another beast had gone and came back with approval in him. Ygritte tied her hair back with a thong and sang under her breath. A wild child's nonsense with a beat in it that made Jon's foot want to mark time and made his teeth set because wanting anything for pleasure in this place was a luxury he could not indulge. Qhorin half smiled and then forgot he had and looked at the line of trees, as if a man he knew were late for an appointment and would come if Qhorin only glared hard enough. In the south, a man in armor tried to sleep on a bed that would not accept him. His dreams were all iron and fire and a boy with a white wolf whose name he did not know and would not know until a winter later, when knowing it would save a wall and a life and a set of vows. In a castle of black stone built by men who thought themselves dragons with human hands, a woman in red warmed her fingers over flames and smiled, not at anything in the room, but at something far away that the fire showed her, a chill in it even as she smiled. She whispered a name that was not Jon's and yet was the way names twist when the fire licks them. In a city of coin and lies, a master of whispers put out a small light with a small breath and sat in the dark, which he preferred because he could hear better that way. He heard the footsteps of men who did not yet know they were walking. Snow falls whether a man speaks or holds his tongue. It does not ask whether he is a Stark or a Targaryen. It marks him with the same cold until he moves. Jon moved. He set his boots in the same careful place as Qhorin set his. He cut his food with his knife and did not look at his hand and think of any other hand that might have held a harp. He held the truth in him as a man holds a hot coal and does not drop it even when it scorches, because to drop it would set the world alight in the wrong place. He let his breath go. He took another. He kept the count. He waited for the horn. He waited for the day the blade without a hilt would have to be lifted, and he did not lift it early to show that he could. When the first white shape moved at the very edge of the trees at dusk, a thing that was a man and not a memory wearing a body, Ghost did not growl. He went still. Stillness is a kind of shout if you have learned how to hear it. Jon laid his fingers on the dragonglass and felt the old cold that did not help and did. The shape at the tree's edge looked at him with an attention as pure as starlight and came on. He did not think of crowns. He did not think of fathers and songs. He thought of the old bear's hands on a table and Robb's hands on his shoulders and Sam's feather and Eamon's patient mouth and the way Ghost's ears flattened at the last moment before a thing happens. He took one step and another. The snow gave back his foot with the quietest of sounds. He was what he had chosen to be this day. The rest would wait. The rest would come. The rest was already coming, slow as winter and just as sure. The thing at the trees came on without haste, the way of something that has forgotten why men hurry. It made no sound that belonged to feet. The only sound was the light, dry kiss of snow-laden branches touching one another as if to console themselves for what moved among them. Ghost went from stillness to the slow lowering of his head that always made Jon's breath shorten. The direwolf's lips did not peel, and yet the teeth looked more present to Jon's eye, as if called. Qhorin's hand lifted with the faintest tilt. His men did what they had learned to do when the forest's edges grew their own eyes. They did not talk. They did not draw breath as if it could fill more than their own small caves of ribs. Jon's fingers slid along the pouch where the dragonglass lay, and the horn, with its long old crack, pressed against the meat of his palm as if to declare that the past had its own opinions about the present. The shape under the trees had been a man once. Jon knew that with the quick, deep recognition a hunter has for a stag that has been wounded long enough to take on the smell of rot. The figure had a ranger's remnants to him, the hang of a ruined cloak, the old bend to the shoulders of a man who had learned to walk in snow without letting it own his stride. Where skin showed through, it was the color of bone that has been boiled too long. Blue light slept inside the sockets and then woke. The waking had no gentleness to it. "Fire," Qhorin said, which was as close to a prayer as he needed. Two men had torches ready, the heads wrapped in rags that had drunk oil by the gallon. One spark and they were mouths, loud in the quiet as if they were proud of being alive. The thing at the trees did not flinch at the light. If anything, it turned its face so the fire could see it better, and then came on with a care that made mock of care. When timber burns, it speaks. When flesh burns under charring leather, it stinks. This had neither voice nor stink until the torch touched cloth, and then it spoke with a dry rush like straw collapsing. The color was wrong, a kind of clean black that made the eye feel tricked. The eyes burned last, and when they went, it was like two little stars deciding they had business elsewhere. Qhorin did not watch long. He was a man who never left his eyes tied to anything that could make his mind slower. He looked instead into the wood behind the burned meat, and in that depth there was a glitter that was not snow, a paler shade of nothing that was not nothing at all. It blinked, or perhaps snow fell between Jon and it, and then the trees were only trees again. "It watches," Qhorin said under his breath, as if the words must be kept for men and not offered to the night. "And it sends its broken to check our numbers and our nerve. It learns. So should we." Jon let his breath go between his teeth and listened to it. He had not moved an inch, and yet his heart had climbed 3 flights of stairs. The horn in his pouch had a thrum in it that was not sound but an awareness, like holding an old tool and remembering who used it last and what for. He had the urge to take it out, and the stronger urge not to make gestures toward mysteries he did not comprehend. He allowed the wanting to pass as the torchlight faded. Ygritte had not cried out. She watched with the flat look of a woman who has lived near death long enough to be bored by other people's fear. When the last of the bones collapsed, she met Jon's gaze without challenge. "You've ghosts," she said matter-of-factly. "Not just the white beast. Your kind bring them with you. Black clothes and old debts." "We burn ours," Jon said. "Good," she said. "Else they'd come looking for a warmer bed." She glanced toward the trees. "Fire's a poor prayer, but it'll do for an answer." They moved again, and the snow accepted them with the same cold charity it offered everything. Qhorin did his counting in his head and out of it both, and when he came at dusk, another dusk, it was always another dusk. With the look men get when a thing has been made in their minds and now must be made in the world, Jon recognized it without any trouble. "You let her go," Qhorin told him, bending to touch his boot strap as if fastening leather could carry his decision into his hands. "Let her go on our word. We need her to talk. Not now. Later. If she does not talk with mouth, she'll talk with feet. Feet tell more truth than tongues." Jon nodded. He did not pretend to like it or dislike it. He took Ygritte to the shadow of a rock that had been split and left to brood, and he cut the thong at her wrists with Longclaw's shadow along the blade, careful not to spill dignity where blood would have been more easily scrubbed away. "What then?" she said, more curious than resentful. She rubbed her wrists without haste. "You go," he said. "And if you run to your men, tell them we are too many and too quick. If you run to the cold, tell it we burn what it sends. If you run nowhere, sleep." She smiled, and it made of her face a place that could have been warm if it had been given different weather. "You're a fool," she said almost kindly. "You know nothing, Jon Snow." He had the oddest urge to laugh, not because it was funny but because the words rang with the comfort of something that would be true no matter what was thrown at it. "Then you'll be safe enough for me," he said, which she seemed to like because she put her hand briefly to his sleeve, a gesture old women use in markets to thank a vendor for not cheating them on onions. When he returned to the Halfhand, Qhorin gave no praise and no rebuke, which was the way of a man who has no use for anything but the work done. "They'll come behind us with a scout's pace and a thief's appetite," Qhorin said, low and even. "We'll let them. They think they are hunting. Men who think they are hunting forget to ask why the deer runs in that direction. We'll show them why when the ground says so." And the ground spoke, as ever it did for Qhorin. He took them along a rib of stone too narrow for 2 men abreast, and then down a slope of loose shale where men had to listen even to their own feet or be betrayed. He drew a finger through the drift under a hawthorn whose bones had blackened and told them to go where he drew, because even the branch king listened to the Halfhand when snow muffled the world. They came to a hollow where wind did not reach at all, where breath stayed where it was put and waited. The wildlings came with their own carefulness and their own certainty. Rattleshirt had bones enough for 2 men and wore them without shame, the way other men wore pride. His mask was a skull with the grin of small, sharp teeth. His voice, when he told men where to put their feet, was hoarser than the ice itself. Ygritte was not with him. Jon was absurdly relieved and annoyed at himself for being so. The first man into the hollow made the sound of a boot finding the space between 2 stones. The second made no sound at all. The third cursed, which is always the thing that signals the end of stealth. Qhorin did not spring the trap then. He let them take 2 more steps each, let them feel the hollow gather around them like a cloak, and then he moved, and they moved with him. It was short work and ugly. Most fights in winter are. The wildlings fought as they always did, with anger and invention and no terror of the shame of running away if running away made more sense. Qhorin used his one hand like 3. Jon kept himself alive without yet daring to call his work artistry. Rattleshirt did not fight like a fool. He made killing practical and stayed out of the way of men who were better at it than he. When it was over, he raised his hands and let the bones clack softly, a sound that said, "Now we speak." "Crow," he said, and the word had no love in it, and no particular hate either. Halfhand and the boy with the white dog. Well then. He looked past Jon, behind him, because he was not a man to put his whole mind on any one man. "You've been taking things that aren't yours since you crossed the stone. We'd like a turn. You, for instance." He pointed at Jon with a bone finger that was as arrogant as a lord's. Qhorin did not look at Jon. He looked at the land, which was how he spoke to men he loved, if he loved. "You'll go with them," he said. "You'll see what they count and what they count on. You'll bring that counting back. If you have to break bread to keep your mouth from being broken, do it. If you have to break your word to keep your word, do it." He shifted his weight and met Jon's eye then for the width of a heartbeat. "When they test you, they'll ask you to pay for your life with a thing only you own. Give it. Give it in a way that buys you a day and another. Not more. I won't." Jon began, not knowing what he would not, only knowing the old terror of becoming someone other than the man he had decided to be. "Won't is a boy's word," Qhorin said, softer than he used with any of them. "You will, because a man does what he has to when the choice is between 2 wrongs and one is worse. Remember who you are when you do it, not who letters say, who you said to the old gods when you put your hand on your father's sword." Jon swallowed the boy's word and locked it somewhere behind his teeth where it could do no harm. Ghost pressed against his leg and made a low sound that men could not hear and wolves understood perfectly. "Don't die like an idiot." "If I must," Jon said to both of them. Rattleshirt laughed with his eyes, not his mouth. "You crows and your high talk," he said. "Give me the boy, Halfhand. Keep your men. I'll take bone coin enough from his hide." He lifted his chin at 3 behind him. "Tie him." Before they could, Qhorin moved. It was as if a cord had been cut and a weight had dropped. He stepped into Jon as a dancer steps into a partner who has been doing this dance since the first fire was built. His blade came up and then down and then around, and Jon only just had time to throw his own sword where it would not take his head clean. They met steel to steel. The shock of it rattled his arm to the shoulder and woke every small ache he had carried all week. "Do it," Qhorin said, low enough that only the bones heard and the boy. "Do it and live. Do it and live long enough to make the doing worth the shame." Jon's mouth tasted of iron and ice and bile. He did not want to. He did not want to. Qhorin came again, harder, with the speed of a man who has made peace with what he has asked from himself. He feinted high and cut at Jon's knee and would have taken it if Jon had let him. He did not. He gave ground and it felt like giving up a piece of his spine, and then he took ground and it felt like stealing, and then he felt the moment, as men do in knives and in message-bearing and in love. It was there, and if you did not take it, it would leave. He took it. His sword went in where Qhorin had made a space. He felt the old man's ribs the way a butcher feels a rack that has hung enough days to stop being stubborn. Qhorin's breath came out once, a sigh that had nothing self-pitying in it. He took Jon's wrist and squeezed hard enough to bruise and make a promise of it, and then he let go. "Well," he said, loudly enough for the bones to be offered a story. "The boy has teeth after all." He fell to his knees. He did not make a show of dying. He did not linger. Jon held him up and did not pretend to be brave about it. He laid him down in a snow that took him as if he were wood or a stone, not a man, and stood because if he did not stand he would be a boy again and never recover. Rattleshirt came forward clapping with bone hands. "Crow kills crow," he said, delighted by the economy of it. "The snow is a better lord than any of yours south. It freezes all your titles the same. Strip him." He told his men without looking at Qhorin. "You!" And the bone finger pointed to Jon again. "Come!" They took Jon's sword and gave it back when Ygritte spoke 2 quiet words in a throat gone hoarse. "He'll not be ours without his tooth," she said. "Let him keep it. If he is what I think he is, he'll carve our bread with it. If he isn't, he'll choke on the first bite." Rattleshirt liked to gamble as much as any man. "Fine," he said. "Carry your own weight, Crow." They took him along the shoulder of the world where the sky seems 1 bad minute from dropping onto your head, and then down into a valley more white than a fresh page, and then up again into the skirts of hills that had never admitted to being merely hills. The cold pressed into his bones and made rooms there to live in. Ghost came when he came and went when he needed to, and none of the wildlings put a rope on him. Even Rattleshirt had decided that bone could splinter as well as clatter. The camp that finally laid itself out before them was no army in the southern sense. It was a town that had decided to walk and kept forgetting it must not put its fires too close to its own feet. Smoke rose in dozens of thin gray threads, and among them moved a shape that had not been drawn by southern hands. Giants had a way of making the ground remember them, and the ground did. One trudged by with a log across his shoulder as casually as a man might carry a child. His beard was a glacier gone soft. His eyes were old and tired and clean. Jon could not help but stare, and the giant glanced back and made a small sound in his nose that had all the contempt of an old man for a boy who mistakes size for wisdom. The mammoths were rougher, shag piled on shag, breath pluming, eyes suspicious of everything and nothing. Ygritte went through this moving village like a woman walking home along the same track she always used when the day's chores were done, and she had a bit of a song to herself. She brought Jon to a great hide tent studded with horn points and hung with black wool and dyed strips of silk that made him think unhelpfully of a boy once who had sat in Winterfell's hall and watched the singer with the patchwork cloak. He did not expect the face that met him when he ducked inside. It was ordinary. That was what was wrong with it. Mance Rayder had no hero's jaw, no eye that made men step back from it. He had the kind of face that could disappear in a crowd because it had learned how to, a man's face that had once been content to be one of many and then had decided to be one who gathers the many. His hair had a little gray in it and his beard less. He wore a cloak of furs and bits of silk and a shirt of good wool and a knife that said he cut meat with it at least as often as he cut men. "Crow," Mance said, with neither scorn nor welcome, the way a cooper might say stave. He sat with his back to a brazier and his hands over the heat just long enough to take the ache out of his fingers, and then he took them away. "I have had you in my mind for a while. A boy with a white wolf comes up black as crow's hit and kills his own to come over the hill to me. That's a story. I have men who will tell it whether I give them the lines or not. Better I give them the lines." His eyes flicked to Ygritte over Jon's shoulder. "And you bring me a guide for the telling. What do you make of him?" "He's not as clever as he thinks he is," Ygritte said without malice. "That helps." Mance smiled small. "It does. The clever ones are always trying to outsmart their own shadows. They trip. The stupid ones trip over loose talk. The ones in the middle." He spread his fingers as if letting smoke escape through them. "We can use, if they let themselves be used." "I am not here to be used," Jon said. He could not help the stiffness. He had been cut and bound and unbound and cut again since dawn, and his skin felt too tight in places. "You're here," Mance said, agreeing. "That's the first thing. You killed the Halfhand." He said it lightly, as if he asked whether Jon had eaten, but his eyes were on the answer. "Yes," Jon said, and felt the word take a piece of him he would not get back. "He asked me to." "That's a crow for you," Tormund Giant's bane boomed from the shadows, stepping forward as if he had heard all he needed and would not pretend politeness by waiting to be summoned. He had a beard that had survived battles on its own. He laughed like a man who would rather laugh than drink and would rather drink than do anything else, and yet he watched Jon as a man watches a fire near old wood. They ask you to do the hard part and leave you to live with it, better than the men in red cloaks who do the hard part and make you live with it anyway. He clapped Jon on the shoulder as if testing whether the meat was cooked. Well, boy, are you going to whimper or are you going to eat? Both are honest work. Let him answer, Mance said. He had the quiet of a man who had decided long ago how to be king and had chosen not to teach his voice to thunder. Why are you here? Because the dead walk, Jon said. Because your people run from them toward my wall. Because my Lord Commander sent me to learn what you mean to do about the dead and what you mean to do about my wall. He held Mance's gaze and did not do him the insult of pretending this was the whole of it. And because the Halfhand told me to go where I could listen. Good, Mance said, not because the words were to his liking, but because they had been set out on the table clean and could be handled. I went to your wall once, a boy with torn wool and a wound that had bled more pride than blood. A woman took me in and sewed color into my cloak where black had failed. When the black tried to claim me again, I could not put it on. They would have me nameless and voiceless and an arm. I found I preferred to be Mance. Men like me when I am Mance. He gestured to a fur-lined stool as if Jon were a guest in his hall and not a captive. Sit. Eat. Free folk do their talking with their mouths full when there is food and with their fists when there is not. Today we can be civil. Jon sat because not sitting would be a boy's refusal and because his legs wanted him to. Meat came and barley bread baked flat and brown as an old hand, and a stew with the ghost of onions in it. He ate the way a man eats after a day of not dying, with thorough appreciation and no greed. Tormund laughed approval and drank from a horn until some of it ran into his beard and he blamed the horn for it and kissed it in apology. Rattleshirt rattled at the door and told a joke that would have been better if he had spoken it with a real mouth and not borrowed teeth. When the bowl was clean, Mance leaned a little forward. You have a beast that is not a dog, he said. You have a face that's been taught not to show more than it wants. You have eyes like your father's. He caught himself and did Jon the honor of not pretending the word had not come. The man who raised you, I met Eddard Stark once. He did not like the red in my cloak, but he liked that my stitches were straight. You carry the north straightness in you and something else. I've had men bring me whispers the last few weeks from south of the snow. A Crannogman came to one of my men when he was hunting frogs not far from the neck and said the wolf had a secret in his den. He said the wolf would not keep it forever. He laughed like water in a reed and went away. Jon kept his hands still where they lay on his knees. Men in halls talk too much, he said, which was the truth and not an answer. Mance said easily, and I listen too much, which is why there are this many fires and not fewer. I don't much care whose seed made you, boy. I care what you make of yourself. Will you be a black bird in my tree telling me when the snakes move? Or will you be a boy trying to straddle two roots until the tree widens and your hips break? He gestured toward the tense opening where the wind wrote its own script. I need the wall to open, not to kill your men, to take my people through. There are children and women and old bones. I would rather bring them under your black than leave them under blue eyes. But I will not do it begging. I will do it with horns and drums if I have to. His eyes moved to Jon's face and rested there. Would your wall open for me if I came with peace in my hands? Jon did not lie. No, he said. Good, Mance said for the third time, meaning admirable because it was clean and difficult. Then we will come with war in ours and make peace out of the scraps. He sat back and draped a piece of red silk over his knee absently, as a man does with something he loves for reasons he has long since taught himself not to examine. Walk my camp, learn the names of my fools. I have as many as any king. He smiled without kindness. We'll make one out of you if you let us. Afterward, under a sky the color of hammered iron, Ygritte showed Jon what he would have known by now if he had done his living north, where to piss so the wind carried it away from sleeping men, where to walk near a sleeping giant and not wake him, where to put your sleeping roll so that your back did not find the only stone in a field when the whole of the field had seemed fair ground. She did it without superiority. She had the cheerfulness of a child too tired to pretend superiority. Once, when he did a thing poorly and did not yet know it, she touched his wrist to correct him, and their skins spoke a language people who live south of winter never hear. His stomach turned traitorously soft for an instant, and he made it hard by thinking of the Halfhand's hand, not the missing one, but the remaining hand and how it had pressed into his wrist at the last. On the wall's far side, the days walked their own hard path. The carts from Robb had turned Qhorin Mormont's temper from iron to tempered iron for a week, which was as good as a summer among books. Men ate better and swore less. They swung their arms with grudges that were smaller than hunger and so were easier to bear. Sam's hands learned the shape of the obsidian Jon pressed into them, small and glossy as if it had drunk night and kept a mouthful for itself. Keep it hidden where you could reach it if the day came when reaching was all you could do, Jon had told him before he went with Qhorin, and Sam had nodded with the solemnity of a priest and stuck it in a place in his belt that only a man that fat could hide a thing and reach it quickly. A raven from the Riverlands brought winter words. It always feels like winter, Bowen Marsh grumbled, but no one would call him poet for it. It said that Theon Greyjoy had brought ships not to the west but to the green coasts of the stony shore and up the fingers of 100 little coves and mouths no lord had counted since the first summer. It said that he had ridden with 20 to Winterfell and forced Maester Luwin to write the name of the new lord of the keep in a hand that did not shake over much because Maester Luwin's hand did not shake if he could help it. He had learned that at Hoster Tully's knee and kept it ever since. It said that 2 boys had been hanged on the walls and skinned, and that the men who had done it had said their names were Bran and Rickon Stark, and that the crows had not asked the boys their names because boys hang without tongues. It said that Robb had stopped in the midst of planning a river crossing and left the tent and put his face in a bucket of cold water and held his breath until his mother dragged him up and called him by his baby name without care for lords. Jon read the letter to the old bear with nothing on his face. It was the only gift he had to give at that moment that would not be resented. Qhorin Mormont took it like a wound. No sound, no calling on gods, only the small nod that says, "This is added to the list of things that will not be born but will be born anyway until I die, because that is the work." "He'll break," Mormont said, meaning Robb, not the letter's edge. "He will or he won't." After a while, he added, "Men are always the last to know how strong boys are." Sam cried in a quiet room where no one but the ravens could hear him. They clicked and pecked and made a thing of it they would repeat later for their own amusement. When he had stopped, he went and found PYP and Gren and told them a joke of his own invention so poor that they had to laugh for its courage, and the 3 of them laughed too long and too high and then walked away from each other without speaking, like men who have burned something they loved because the house would have gone if they had not. Robb read the same letter in a different camp and sat down as if he had been walking and someone had pulled his knee from the socket. Catelyn took it from his hand and did not read it at once. She held it between thumb and forefinger like a thing still too hot, and then she read it carefully. She did not look at the words twice. She looked once, and once was enough. The habit of a woman who has read letters that are less letters than knives. "It may be true," she said of a thing it could not be, "and it may be false, of a thing that only a monster would say, and since we cannot fix either truth or falsehood tonight, we will go on breathing, and in the morning you will command and men will obey because that is your work." She told herself the thing she had told Jon, that to tell the truth to those who could bear it was the work of the living, and then she did something that was not truth and was mercy. She went to the place where Jaime Lannister's chains had rubbed the skin on his wrists raw when he had jerked against them by night. She put a key to a lock. She did it with a set jaw, and when a man came with an oath on his lips, she said his name and told him to fetch Brienne, and he did not call her traitor because he did not dare and because he had been a boy when she had given him cheese on a summer day and he had never forgiven her for being kind. She led the Kingslayer out as if she led a dog she did not trust not to bite a child. She put him on a horse and set a woman as strong as a wagon across his path to hold him to it. She put her hope in a chain of maybes and had the grace to admit she had done it, without pretending to herself that anyone would thank her for it later. Theon Greyjoy stood in the great hall of Winterfell with his father's boasting on his head and his sister's smile like a small knife at his ribs and his own hands wanting to be clean and unable to find water. He lay at night in a bed he had dreamed of for 10 years and could not sleep for the smell of smoke in the rushes from fires long out. A boy named Wex, who did not speak, watched him with a loyalty that felt like a bad-fitting cloak. He wore it because to take it off would make him feel naked. Sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, Theon thought of Jon as if the bastard's name had a round stone inside it he could suck to keep his mouth from drying out. He hated himself for it and felt worse after. He told himself he had chosen a house that would allow him to be a prince. He found that being a prince in a burned place makes a man smell like char. The horns did not blow 3 times at the fist until the night had already learned 100 different words for dark. Before that moment, the Watch's men doused their fires when the air began to taste too clean. The mountaintop held a cold that laid itself along the bones and stayed. Men bound brush into cages around the hill's hollow heart and sharpened stakes for pits where they did not expect to fall in themselves. They set a ring of horses and held their breath when the animals put their ears back in that unusual fashion horses have when they feel a sound thrug. Their hooves. Sam held his obsidian as a friar holds a relic, without faith at first, only with hope, and then with faith because hopelessness is cowardice when a man can still move his fingers. It was not the White Thing's steps that woke them to crisis. The dead do not have to touch the ground to move the night. It was the cold. Not the winter cold. Not wind biting nose and cheek and the places under the eyes where blood runs near the skin. This was the stillness of a room where breath is not invited. Fires that had been coaxed into life like children fell silent, embarrassed to have thought themselves important. A sound came like glass shrieking, and then something was among them that made men want to become smaller than their own bones. The first scream was short and not a scream exactly. It was a breath cut. The second was a shout with words in it that did not help anyone. Sam ran without style because style is for men who do not think they are dying. He fell, and the thing that came toward him wore form enough to be a man, and was not a man and had eyes that made the old tales seem tame. Jon did not see this. He was counting other cold and other eyes. But later, in the telling, he could see it as clearly as if it had been his own nightmare. He could feel the obsidian in Sam's fist, slick from snow and fear. He could feel the way old words would not come to a mouth that had food and drink and laughter as its main vocabulary. He could feel Sam turn and put the knife where a man would be a man, the place meat gives a little under ribs, and feel how the world changed its laws for an instant because a man had put a piece of black night into a body that had been claimed by a different night. The other's cry was not a cry. It was the sound a harp makes when fire is brought too near and the strings draw themselves tight and snap. The body went like a pillar does when a river eats its base 1 grain at a time for 1,000 years and then finally takes the last. It left behind nothing that should have been able to hold together without soul or marrow. Sam stood with his own breath loud in his ears and said, "I did it. To no one and to everyone and to the gods." Then he ran again because you do not stop to count your victories when the night is still counting its own. Men lived and died in the white. They slid down the fist in a slow disarray that was not a rout because Jeor Mormont did not allow routs near his name if he could help it. He held a line and then another and then told them truthfully that the next line would kill them if they tried to hold it and to move instead. Horses died like men, and men died like horses, and some that had been one became too much like the other for any friend to touch. Dawn had no opinion about any of it. It came because it had been scheduled to. When the light finally took pity on them, Mormont counted and was counted, and a smaller number went forward with him than had climbed the hill. Sam found that his hands shook only when he stopped and that if he never stopped he could avoid the shaking. Gren shook for him and for Ed and for PYP and for those who would never shake again. He did it in a spare moment with his back to a rock so that the men who looked to him would think him merely thinking hard. News travels in winter like a weasel under a henhouse. Across the north, men who had sworn to the young wolf gathered quiet rumors about dead men walking and a prince in black who might be more, and some laughed and added a cup to the jug to show they were not afraid, and others did not laugh and sharpened axes that would never be used on trees again if things went badly. In King's Landing, the thought of winter was as exotic as the thought of honesty in certain rooms. Tyrion Lannister cosseted his green jars as if they were the only children he would ever be allowed to care for and whispered to them about ships. Cersei painted her mouth redder and said her son was a king and believed it in the way a woman believes a mirror when no other face has smiled at her in years. Ser Jorah Mormont, sweating in a city where the heat sits on men, thought of his father in another cold with love that had turned itself into something like a debt too late to pay, and a girl who called herself Mother of Dragons listened to a wind that had crossed salt and said winter as if it were a joke and then again as if it were a threat. Jon walked the wildling camp and learned the names that would matter. Tormund Giantsbane, who would call him boy even when he was old and king if he lived. Rattleshirt, whose bones would outlast his uses. Val, who could say no better than any man could say yes. Dalla, whose smile would turn a camp into a home if the night allowed it. He learned the quiet ones, too. Men who wove and mended, women who carried and counted. The boy who ran between cooks with a pot that was always half full because there was always someone hungrier. The old woman who told tales as a trade and took bits of hide and a worn pebble in payment because hard winters demand cheap gods. At night he lay with ghosts stretched along his shins or not at all, and he dreamed less often and more deeply. The hall with the harp receded and then returned. Sometimes, he stood at the dais and saw a man with hair dark as a raven's wing where the hair had not gone to frost yet. Sometimes the man raised his head and Jon saw that his mouth had his own stubborn sadness when he was tired. The music came in uneven, tender plucks, as if the player were practicing for a performance that would never come. He did not ask the dream to speak. He took what it offered. Ygritte taught him the songs of the free folk, rough tunes hammered to fit many mouths. He did not sing them, not at first. When he finally did, it surprised him that his mouth remembered how to shape foolishness. She laughed and told him he sang like a boy with a frog in his throat, and then took him by the hand to a place apart where the snow had turned to slush in the day's small grace, and then frozen in a pattern that looked like scales in the night. "You always look like someone's going to judge you," she said, amused and tired both. "Stop it. The sky doesn't care. Your gods don't care. If they did, they wouldn't hide in trees. Be a man and stop fussing about being a good one." "I try," he said without bravado. "I see it," she allowed. "You don't have to try with me. All I need from you is the truth when it matters and silence when it doesn't." He was learning both, but slowly. He did not tell her his truth. The letter in his boot pressed heavy sometimes when he took it off at night, as if the words inside it could still alter their weight. He kept his mouth shut about fathers and the kinds of kings men meant when they said the word quietly in their sleep. He spoke instead about snow and stew and the way ghost could vanish into day when the day was white enough. She told him the names of stars as the free folk keep them: the cradle, the widow's coin, the fox with his tail on fire, and for the first time in months he felt the sky as a place he could talk to. One morning that began like any other in a land that had forgotten most of its mornings, Mance called the camp to a ring roughly drawn, men and women and giants near the back because giants were courteous when they remembered to be. Mance stood, and Tormund stood beside him because he was big and loved being seen. Rattleshirt stood because he loved being feared and often made do with being noticed. Between them they brought forward a thing wrapped in old furs. When the furs fell away, men drew breath in and wished they had not. It was a horn, larger than any ram's, too big for a man to blow without a giant's chest under it. Its surface had once been black and glossy and now had a dullness like ash and old fat. Bands of bronze circled it hammered with runes that made the eye skitter as if letters had been taught to move. It smelled faintly of earth under snow, of things buried in the old time that men now misremember as stories. "This is a lie and a truth," Mance said casually. "It is not the horn of Jorah because that's a story. It is the horn we have to stand in for it because men need a thing to give names to or they stop having faith in the names." He put his hand on it in a way that suggested neither reverence nor contempt. "It was a tool. If we blow it, some of you will piss yourselves," he said cheerfully. "But the wall will not fall. The wall does not remember men's breath. It remembers ice. We will make it listen to us another way." Jon thought of the small cracked horn in his pouch and of a dream of a hall with a harp, and the two thoughts made a chord in him he could not name. He kept his face smooth and his hands away from his belt. Ygritte watched him and did not pry, which was the closest thing to kindness she knew how to do. When he slept that night, the harp song had changed. The old melody underlay a new, less graceful one. Horn and string working against one another until the ear learned to fit them, until the mind understood how beautiful resistance can be when it has no choice but to become harmony. Far to the south, a different horn blew, long and low and obscene with confidence. It echoed against city walls that had been built to impress boys and herd merchants. Wildfire waited like a greedy god under the river, green eyes closed, dreaming of a chance to look at the world and show it a color it had not believed in. Stannis Baratheon's ships moved squarely, without flourish, as a man's march is square. He did not dress his war in silk. He did not put songs to it. Tyrion laced his fear with labor and spoke to men until their ears bled and then spoke more, because talking was the only weapon he had that did not cost lives. Sansa Stark, Sansa Lannister to the chancellors who wrote neat lines in thick books, stood in a sept with candles and women and the smell of wax and hope, and prayed to all the gods and to one who was no god at all, merely a man with a father men had forgotten to hate properly. The bells rang and rang and rang and then stopped and started again in a pattern that would be legend within a fortnight. Stannis' shadow went hunting. Renly's candle blew out earlier. It had to. That is how the story goes. Davos Seaworth lost 4 sons and found himself standing on a rock while green fire showed him the secret hunger of water, and he could not tell his grief from the salt on his lips. Cersei held a child on her lap and made a promise to herself she would break not out of weakness but because the world would not let her keep it. Such are the promises that haunt good women and bad equally. Joffrey Baratheon pointed a sword at nothing and later went to his mother because he had wet himself. Sandor Clegane discovered that a wound he had pretended not to care about had gone rotten in his soul, and he ran as men will when they can no longer pretend to their own strength. There is a sort of grace in that, too. Winter does not care about any of this, and yet it is made up of it. On the far side of that white, Jon counted fires and sons and mothers and found himself almost fond of Tormund, who told stories of bedding bear wives with such gusto that it did not matter whether he had. He found himself almost honest with Ygritte, and then this frightened him. He muted the fear by throwing himself at work, keeping count, making maps in his head, learning how to look at a line of blue-black hills and see the path that was a path because wind said so rather than men. He learned how long women with small children could walk before rage turned to despair and how to get them to stop one moment sooner. He learned the names of the men Mance trusted most and those he pretended to trust because they were too popular to offend. He learned he had a little talent for hiding truths in the open. He also learned what it was to be someone's story. Men told his tale around the fire in his hearing, as if he were a work of their hands. The boy with the white wolf, the boy who killed his own, the crow who howled with wolves, the prince in black whose sword drank brothers' blood without complaint. The last came from a man who had been to the Shadow Tower once and had left because men there had made him cut his hair. Jon sat and ate a hard oatcake and chewed it down with care and did not correct any of them. The last almost made him get up and walk away. He did not. If he was to be a blade without a hilt, he would at least keep a cloth wrapped around part of it. When the truth found a voice in the north, it came from a source no one at Mance's fire would have guessed. It came in a letter Roose Bolton wrote with his neat hand to a cousin he wished to flatter into treachery later if the chance came. It came in a speech the great Jon bellowed over ale to men who loved him more for his honesty than any for his prudence. It came in the mouth of a singer with a patch at his collar, who had never been to Winterfell but had been to enough kitchens to know that the salt goes always at the right hand and that women love a story with a good lie in it. It spread by small boats along the Trident like oil, taking the color of whatever it touched, slicking everything it sat near. A boy with a clear face and a better memory than understanding whispered it in an alley in King's Landing, and Varys listened and did not move his eyes. He was careful, but even careful men need to breathe. A red woman in a cold hall far to the east smiled, and did not explain her smile to the man whose face was built of lines and flint. He did not ask. He was a king in his own mind, and kings ask less than they should. Jon heard a scrap of it from Ygritte in the tepid dark after rain. She had gone to listen to an old woman's tale and came back with a story of a wolf that married a dragon and made a boy who could be both. She told it laughing because all songs are ridiculous, and then she watched his face as if she recognized a note in it only she could hear. "Ah," she said softly, "so that's the tune other men dance to when you walk by." He tried to smile and could not, and then he made himself able to. "They dance poorly," he said. "It's not a song worth dancing to." "Songs aren't worth," she said, lying down beside him as if she were laying a knife on a bench. "Songs are stories. Stories are how we carry food when there's no food. If they're wrong, we still eat. And if they're poison?" He did not know why he asked it. The question was not for her. "Then you die and other fools learn not to sing that one," she said comfortably. "Or they don't and then more die." She rolled onto her back and looked at the low scud of clouds as if they were goose down. "Sing me yours, Jon Snow, when you've decided what tune you mean." He did not sing. He touched her hand and let go. That was the only truth he could carry without dropping something he could not afford to lose. Word of Theon's fall came late. It always does. Shame is a lazy bird. Stark men marched to lift Winterfell and found a burned shell and boys' bones black on the gatehouse. Robb's face closed, and something in him stepped back and slammed a door that would not open again easily. He called his lords and counted them and did the thing he could do, war, which is often the only coin a young king knows how to spend. He did not speak Jon's name when he made his plans. He did not need it. The weight of it lay in the tent like a sword across a stool, present in the way of steel in a room, not a thought until it had to be won. Brienne took a man with a golden hand on a road that did not care who he was and made him sleep on the ground and fed him what she ate and taught him, very slowly, to reach for a better self that he did not think existed. Catelyn knelt in a godswood with no faces in it, because the Tullus had planted their trees without expectation of answers, and she prayed anyway, which is all the gods have ever asked, if they ask. On the far cold, Mance drew his men tighter and set them to building in ways that looked like play and were not. He sent Tormund east and Rattleshirt west and kept the women nearest himself, because armies are built of their kitchens as much as of their spears. Jon watched and learned and waited. He did not yet know what message to send. He did not yet know how to live in two truths without rotting between them. He practiced becoming a man who could. He took Ghost out one day away from the tents, into a valley where the sunlight came late and left early and a cleaner wind sat, a wind that had not learned the taste of people. They walked together for a while without purpose, because purpose is as exhausting as fear if you let it be. Ghost stopped at a stand of young pines, their needles shockingly green under all the white, and began to dig with that same steady insistence he had in the ring of stones. Jon knelt and helped, if help it was, scooping aside powder that puffed and then settled to disguise itself again. There was nothing under it this time. No chest, no skin, no graveyard of the old times tools. There was only earth, frozen hard as a butcher's block. Ghost nosed it and sneezed and looked at Jon as if to say, "Not every scratch reveals a prize." "No," Jon said, smiling into his scarf. "Some just make you remember how it feels to have a nose." He sat back on his heels and let the cold take his face. It burned as it always did, and then it was gone, and the numbness came, and he was a boy again behind the kitchens at Winterfell, teaching a girl with a skinny face how to make snow into balls that would hold together long enough to throw, and not so long they became ice. He let the memory touch him and then move on. When he returned to the camp, Mance sent for him. People get used to being sent for by kings, by captains, by cooks. They make a face of acceptance or irritation and go. Jon went with the even acceptance of a man who understands the usefulness of a certain kind of obedience. Mance was sitting with his patchwork cloak on his knees doing the work of a woman, mending a seam with a long threaded needle. He did not look ashamed of it. "A king who never sews is a king who never has his hands in his own life," he said, without preamble or explanation. "Your wall does not know yet what it will have to do. When it does, it will call for you, and you'll have to decide which answer to put in your mouth. You will do it, not the men who wrote you down for their own reasons." "I know," Jon said. "You don't," Mance said, not unkindly. "You think you know. Men do until the day comes. Then they learn they've been practicing for the wrong battle." He bit the thread with his teeth and spat the end into the fire. "You'll go south with Tormund the day after tomorrow. He'll take a mouthful of men and a goatskin bladder of fools, and he'll set them to the wall like a man sets ants to a sugar. You'll go as one of his sons. You have his word for it. He named you 2 cups ago." He lifted his head and called, "Tormund." Tormund appeared like weather. "What do you want now, Mance, you old stubborn stew? Can't you see I'm telling this boy's wolf how to drink without dripping?" "Take him with you," Mance said. "Make him lie and tell the truth as needed. Show him where to put his foot when he's scared. Give him a story to tell his black brothers that will be almost true." Tormund's grin made a noise by itself. "I'll take him," he said readily. "He's almost pretty enough to pass for my get. He'll have to eat more, though. My lads are thick through the chest, so their hearts have a room to drink in." "Feed him," Mance said, going back to his seam. "Don't let him die stupid. That's your trouble, you cagey crow," Tormund told Jon, pulling him out by the arm as if he were the man with the tent and Jon the child. "You always want to die noble. Noble is for songs. We need you for soup and shit and the work of winter." He leaned closer and his breath was not unpleasant, merely honest. "And don't look so sour when men call you prince. It is a poor man's game, but we must let them have it if it makes them walk a mile you need them to." "I've no wish to be prince," Jon said, which was true in that moment and would be true on many others and false on some when the choice went deep enough to scrape bone. "Good," Tormund said, as if Jon had told him a joke. "Then you'll be a better one if the world makes you." That night, Jon did sing. He did it with his face turned toward the hide of the tent and his hand on Ghost's flank. He sang a Winterfell song, a thing of cook fires and apple boughs and a girl with sap on her fingers to keep her from crying when she fell. He sang it as if he had a harp at the end of his tongue and as if no one would ever write down the words. Ygritte listened and did not interrupt and did not laugh when he had done. "There," she said, as if she had pushed him up a ledge and admired the view he had been too stubborn to look at. "That one's true." The next day brought snow with teeth and a sky that had chosen to be a bruise. Tormund gathered men with shouts that were somehow tender. "You big ears, you hair legs, bring that slash-eyed son of a sow with the good laugh." And they went like a river, breaking around stones and then coming together again, following the lay of the land, finding their own depth. Rattleshirt went with them because he hated to be left out of any mischief that could turn a man into a story. Ygritte went because she would not let Jon go where she had not and because she liked to watch him be careful. It made her feel like a woman who had built her own house. They wore snow-like uniforms by mid-morning and set their shoulders into the wind. "Tell me about your father," Ygritte said at some point, because women always come at the heart by asking a sideways question on the way to an ordinary place. "He was an honest man," Jon said, which was in one sense a lie and in another sense the cleanest truth he could manage. "And your mother?" Ygritte said, as if she asked about his teeth. "She had a laugh like hot cider," he heard himself say, and the moment the words left his mouth he knew where he had found them. Catelyn Stark's gloved fingers on his cheek, a softened memory, a guess turned into a truth because it was useful. Something like "give me a name," he had said to Ygritte, and she had given him one and he had believed it at once, even if he knew he should not. "She loved blue roses," he almost said and did not, because that would have taken him to a place he had not earned. "You make her pretty when you speak of her," Ygritte said. "Men do that. They make even their mothers into girls with clean hands." "I'll believe you if you tell me she had a scar." She laughed at his face. "All right then, keep her laughter. You'll need it to clean your tongue when it starts to lie to me." "I don't like lying to you," he said. "Then lie well," she said, practical as a midwife, "so I can enjoy it, or don't lie at all, and then we'll see if we can stand each other without the pride of it getting in our way." Toward dusk, with the day making its old bargain with night, they came to the edge where the white world ended and the black line of the wall broke the sky. Jon had been on one side of it so long he had forgotten how it looked from the other, the way it rose like a threat not from men but from the earth itself, the way it caught light and made it into something else, the way it seemed to be thinking. Tormund spat and nodded, as if to a rival he admired. "Big," he said, "but not smarter than us. That's the trick with big things. Don't let them think for you." They camped so close to its shadow that men's voices found echoes off ice. Jon lay awake and thought of boys walking the top with their faces turned to the night and their mouths full of other men's words. He could call out and perhaps some boy would look down and see the face of someone who had eaten at his table last winter. He did not. He listened instead to the wall's silence and found in it a kind of mercy. It kept secrets because it had its own. At dawn, Tormund sent men to lay snares where horses would not expect their legs to go, and sent others to wave and run and get shot at. And he sent Jon and Ygritte and a narrow fellow with a seamed mouth along a deer track he swore he had used himself when he was a lad. "There," he said, pointing with his whole arm rather than his finger because he had never learned to be small. "There's a gate men cannot see with their eyes because they don't believe in it. That's the one we like. You talk like a septon sometimes," Ygritte told him. "Better," Tormund said, unoffended. "I make sense." They moved. Jon's breath made a little cloud that fell apart and remade itself and fell again. In the distance, a horn blew twice and then once and then twice again in a private code. Jon wondered who had invented it and how they had taught their lungs to be as patient as numbers. He felt the letter in his boot press into his ankle, and he thought, "I cannot carry all of this and be quick." He could. He must. Somewhere on that same morning, a woman with red hair put a match to a fire and watched the flame and saw a boy on a white wall and the shadow of a dragon on new snow and a king who thought himself hard learning how much harder winter is. She smiled and then stopped smiling because she did not want to waste warmth. A man with a crown made of iron and need looked into the same fire and saw only his own stubbornness reflected back. He named it duty and it would serve him as well as any god. Somewhere else entirely, on a river that had decided to be a mirror just this once. A boat with a single passenger and a cargo of anger slid toward a city that had not decided whether to let him live. The man had a stump where his honor had been. He had a woman whose honor was not the kind men wanted a woman to have, and he had a debt in his mouth he meant to pay. He would speak to his brother and call it kindness, and it would be unkindness and kindness both. That is how families are made. The world goes on. Snow falls. Men hol. Boys make choices and sleep poorly for them. Jon Snow, whose name had been written one way and meant another, crouched under a tree whose needles kept their green, and he waited for the sound to tell him whether today he would be a crow or a wolf or someone no story had prepared a name for. Ghost leaned his warm weight into Jon's calf and then away, as if to say, "Choose quickly. The cold does not like to be kept waiting." He could feel the decision ahead as one feels a change in weather in the knee. He put his hand to the ice and did not flinch. He had kept one oath when he came back to the wall after handing his brother a truth. He would keep another and break a third and mend a fourth, as men do when the world is large and time is short. He took breath into his chest and let it out without seeing whether it made a cloud that would reveal him. He woke every sense he had and several he did not and placed his foot where men do not often place theirs. He went forward. Snow had a way of telling a man that he was small without making a speech of it. At the foot of the wall, the white rose on white, thin and fine where wind had scraped it, drifted deep where wind had not. The ice itself was not white at all up close, but the mad blue of a sky drowned under centuries, with milk veins and cloud whirls and a darkness at its heart that made men step back without knowing why. Tormund stood with his hands on his hips and his beard caught half in the wind and half out of it, squinting as if the wall were an old rival who had got fat, and he loved it the more for that. "Up," he said, cheerful as a man calling boys from play to work. "Up and over, you maggots. Then we'll see if the men in black can count past their own fingers." Ropes went up first, thin ants against a pane of frozen sky. Iron spikes sang high, a delicate ringing like a spoon against a glass, as men tested what had to hold their weight. The ice took those blows like a god that has heard prayers for 1,000 years and is no kinder for them. Orell's eagle wheeled once and twice and settled far off, a scribble of dark against paler cloud, as if to deny noticing them at all. Orell himself watched Jon without watching him, a man with too much pride in the thing that let him leave his meat when he pleased. The Magner's men, hard faces and eyes that had learned to count how much a man might gold them for, checked each other's knots and did not speak. Ygritte spat into her palm and caught the rope as if it had proposed marriage. Ghost walked the line with Jon until the first men began to grow small. The direwolf's ears were forward, his nose busy with reading what the ice remembered of men and wind and old storms. Jon put both hands deep into the thick fur behind Ghost's skull and found the warmth there, a human theft without shame. "Stay," he told him, and Ghost's eyes flicked to his and away, the way a beast does when it understands the word and refuses to admit it. He turned and went at last, a white shape melting into the low fishbelly light of morning. Ygritte glanced down at the place where Ghost had been and back up at Jon. "Your shadow leaves," she said, amused. "If it goes where shadows go, I hope it bites them." "He will find me again," Jon said. It was not a boast. It was how he understood the world. In that understanding, he was rich. They climbed. Men make their own weather against ice, breath going gray and then whiter and then invisible again when the wind takes it. The sound is iron in the mouth, and the rope speaks to the hands and tells its old story. "You are heavier than you think, boy. Take me or do not." The first 20 feet are bravado. The next 100 are penance. After that, there is only the small business between a hand, a spike, a boot, and a blue face that is not a face at all. The ice ran wet where sun had warmed it and then cooled it again. Water found the lines men loved to cut and wrote in them. It froze and made those lines lies. Men cursed in whispers and blessed in the same. Jon climbed without wasting anything. His breath was counted out of him. His hands set and reset with no pride and no panic. Below him, Ygritte was all rope and teeth as she bit it to hold while she hammered, all iron and insults. Above him, Jarl of the Thens moved as if his bones remembered this and his meat had agreed to try. Orell went like a spider up a wall, swift and brittle. He placed a spike where Jon would not have placed one, and another to prove the first was not a mistake. At a ledge no wider than a man's boot, Jon paused because a pause was what sense required. He pressed his cheek to the ice and felt it give him nothing back. It was too old for that. Ygritte came up level with him and bumped his hip with hers because she could. "Don't look down," she said, and then looked down with a perverse glee that lived at the back of her throat when danger was near. "It's a long way to be wrong." "I'm not wrong," Jon said and almost smiled. "Not yet," she said and grinned. The grin froze and thawed and froze again on her mouth as she moved on. They were 3/4 the way when the wall itself muttered. That is the only word Jon had for it. A sound like a house with old timbers settling in a wind. A complaint from the marrow of a thing that has borne too much without thanks. The ice under Jarl's left hand shifted with a noise Jon would hear months later when he woke too quickly. A long glassy sigh. Orell swore, not fearfully, but with fury, the sound of a proud man betrayed by matter. "Hold," he snapped, and men held because it was that or die. The chunk that let go did not fall straight. It peeled off in a slow, graceless movement and slid along the face and took 3 spikes and a swath of rope with it. Jarl shouted once as he lost the line that was not meant to be lost. It was not a word. It was the sound a child makes when cold water catches him across the chest. He threw his right arm hard and caught an old iron pin driven into blue decades ago by men who had been too stubborn to die. It held. He hung by it with his feet kicking air that could not be kicked. Orell was above him, rope taut, every muscle align. "Climb," he hissed. "Don't swing like meat. Climb." Jarl tried. The pin creaked, then sang a small tragic song. All around, the rope music, the ice music, the breath music picked up its tempo because fear is a drummer. Ygritte's fingers were white on her iron. She had a spike ready and nowhere to put it that would hold. Jon looked once at the old pin and knew it would not keep its promise. He did not know how he knew any more than he knew which way the wind would change a heartbeat before it did. "Left," he said, without time to explain how he had decided. "Jarl left. Left as ice," Jarl grunted, his voice a tight rope in its own right. He looked, though, because men will look when a voice has that timber in it. The blue there was wrong. Glass over black. A trap, but beyond it, a line where snow had crusted and not gone to melt. A seam of white that might take an iron if a man forced it to. He made himself longer by an inch, stretched, and drove the spike with all the folly and all the faith he had left. The bit, He exhaled a sound that had been waiting. He put weight to it. The old pin sighed again, then quieted. Jarl moved, inch on inch, and lived. When they made the top, the world opened with a violence of light. The sky was so near and so clean you could have believed in gods that wanted to be kind. The land to the south was a gray and brown undulation, a sleeping beast of hills and trees and frozen water, the north behind them a white that did not admit to end. Wind took them by the hair and shook them like dogs. Men laughed in that terrible relief that comes when you have done the very thing your bones begged you not to do and survived. Ygritte stood with both hands on her knees, spit the last of her fear out onto the blue, then caught Jon's collar and hauled him into her kiss, as if it were the handhold that would keep her from falling. For a moment he thought of winter apples and wood smoke and the taste of the water in the gods would pool when snow begins to melt. For a moment he was a boy and not a crow and not a prince in anyone's story. He put both his hands in her hair under the rough fox skin, and the moment ended because moments always do when wind is so cold. "Don't look like that," she said, reading him and disliking the book. "I was cold. That's all." "That's all," he agreed, and the lying felt less like a sin than a stitch in a wound. Orell watched them with the kind of contempt men cultivate when they fear their own softness more than any blade. He had brought his eagle up in a way Jon did not pretend to understand, and the bird sat with one clawed foot wrapped about a pinion of leather Orell had hammered into the ice itself, perfectly content with the thin air and the height, as if he had been born to it. He peered at Jon with the alien disinterest of a thing that has never known a promise kept for its own sake. Down was worse than up. Muscles that had learned one language had to unlearn it and speak another. Fear learns faster going down. The south face was less ragged, more cruelly smooth where the sun had come for its summer after summer and glazed it, where south wind had polished it, where rain had made of it a glass more treacherous for being beautiful. Men used too much rope and then not enough. They swore old gods and new and a few that had never heard those names spoken together. Twice the ice sounded offended and half an acre of it sloughed off like the hide of a beast. Twice men hung and did not fall. Jarl did not. The second time, some tired fool behind him had put a spike into a seam that had no depth. When the skin slid, it took that iron and the man clipped to it and 3 more. The rope tore Jarl's glove and his skin beneath, and he could not find purchase again because there are moments when a man is meat and he knows it. He had time to look up. His face was not noble. It was a man's face who has been denied a small thing he thought he owned. Orell did not move for him. Ygritte made a sound like a string broken on a cheap harp. The white took Jarl without drama. He fell long enough to know that he was falling and then long enough to forget anything else. They watched because there is nothing else to do in such a moment that is not a lie, and then they did not speak his name because speaking names steals warmth in that kind of cold. On the ground at last, men walked as if they did not trust the earth to take their weight anymore. Tormund embraced them with his roar that had kept itself warm the whole day and slapped Jon until his teeth clicked and then apologized by slapping him again. "Down," he said, delighted with a job men could not sing about properly. "You are my lads now. You'll drink with me tonight or I'll piss in your shoes." They did not drink much. Exhaustion makes for the most temperate of men. Jon slept with his mouth open like a boy, dreamless, because the day had used up even his capacity for nightmares. In the morning, the land beyond the wall spread itself before them like a house that had never been theirs and yet had been built to their measures all the same. The air smelled different, as it always did, less old, more mean. It had the stink of men in it the way a cup has the taste of whatever it last held even after washing. They moved south in a torn line, not so much an army as a weather, slipping along hedgerows, digging in old snow behind broken walls, sending little parties like stray thoughts ahead to irritate the road and harass carts and scare sheep into silence. Jon learned the South's poor hides and poor boots now were worse than the wildlings' poor hides and poor boots, because the South lived in the expectation of summer, and expectation is always the cruelest teacher when winter comes instead. They ate what could be found and what could be stolen and what could be traded for a story. Better pay than coin in some of those outlying farms, especially when a woman's husband had a conscience and she did not. They came at last into low country near a long lake that had forgotten the wind's name for a day. There stood Queen's Crown, a tower of wetted stone on its hummock out in the marsh, like a finger stuck up at the sky to see which way the wind blew. The village crouched near it, half thatch fallen, half wattle picked clean. Rats had taken the rest and died fat. The causeway that led to the hill went crooked on purpose, as men build when they fear riders. Orell's eagle had taken to sliding low along the reeds now, arrogant, alert. It cast his cold eye back at Jon whenever it pleased. The Magner's men argued low and swift about whether they might take the tower for a night's shelter, and whether that would show to watchers on the wall a mouth open too wide. Tormund spat and shrugged. To him, shelter was a barrel word. Any liquid he poured into it would do. They had no chance to decide. An old man on a shag-bellied garron came across the causeway, bundled to the nose, a stack of twig bundles at his saddle, the day's poor fuel. He saw them, and the seeing made a noise in him he stifled with his fist, a quick child's sob. The garron shied to run. The causeway's old shape saved him a pace and then betrayed him at the next. The horse's hoof slid and the beast slewed and the bundles went and the old man with them. He ambled, heaved, made a valiant hash of getting back to the saddle. Jon admired that and was sickened by it both. The Magner's men were on him like winter on a stream. Cold, impersonal, everywhere. Kill him, the Magner said, because it was the easy command of a man who would not be the one to do it. He's seen us. Ygritte looked at Jon as if the words had hit her in the spine where she was raw. She put her bow in his hand without saying anything. Orell looked without looking, as if he waited for meat to do what meat does. Tormund scratched at his beard and said nothing because there is a time to say nothing, even for Tormund. Jon's hand knew the bow. His heart knew the man. He saw him as what he was, old, cold, foolish enough to think today would be like yesterday. He saw him the way a wolf sees, without words. He saw the arrow leave and find the place under his chin where living has always been a fragile business for men. He could do that, he had done that. He could not. He could not do this and be able still to speak to himself tomorrow. It was not honor. It was a small home he had built inside himself and did not mean to burn for this. He lowered the bow. "Boy," the Magner said, contempt with relish. "Prince of puppy blood." Ygritte took a step, fast and simple, and loosed. The arrow went through leather and old breath. The old man made the soft involuntary mew that comes to men who have lived long enough to forget how much of dying is small. He dropped and did not trouble anyone again in this world. The garron stood with its ears forward and chewed the leather reins in a lost way. Jon's stomach rolled like a boat. Orell laughed without heat. "So that's done," he said, and his eagle launched and flew and flew and flew to tell all the reeds and all the crows of the marsh that men had moved here today. The storm came up at dusk with more malice than most. The lake leapt up and hit itself with fists of wind. The reeds rattled as if they were teeth. The causeway went slicker than the inside of a fish. The tower's top was a broken lid. Rain came in, then wet snow, then rain again, indecisive as a lord's second son. They put themselves into the shell of it and tried to be smaller than water. In the night, the Magner's men came like a sentence that had learned to climb. Orell's eagle had told them what to say and where to say it. The first showed in the slit-shaped door with a knife in his teeth in a way that would have seemed comic any other day. Ygritte's arrow took him in the soft place behind the knee and he went down without a word, which Jon respected and did not learn from, foolishly. The second came through the window hole like a bad dream. Jon took him with Longclaws flat against temple, hard, because killing was not the work that would save them. Speed was. Orell himself entered in body and in bird both. He pushed a man ahead of him to take Ygritte's next arrow and then made to push Jon back into empty space. They were in tight confines and clumsy. It was terrible work. It was enough. "Cut him," Orell hissed, breath hot and sour with pride. "Cut the south out of him." Jon did not bother with answer. He put his sword as though it would be where Orell's mouth had once liked to be. The man twisted. The blade took him where there is always blood. He spat and grinned and died with malice, as if he had saved a bit of himself for that purpose alone. His eagle shrieked the way a woman does when a dish she loves slips from her hand, and beat its wings until wind spoke through them, and struck. The beak was not a beak then. It was a chisel. The talons were not talons but small bright knives. Jon felt his cheek split under it and hot wetness run and grow cold at once. He struck without aim, anger trying to be skill. The point of his sword broke wing before it found the small desperate heart. The bird died harder than Orell had, 10 times more alive. It bit even while it went. Jon saw for an instant in the place between the bird's eyes something that wanted to be human and failed. Later, when he lay awake in a different dark, he would remember that and be angry and sad, and then angry again and then nothing. Ygritte had been with him, then not. That is how the night told its tale. They stole the moment when men outside swore and reorganized to run. They ran across the causeway that was not designed for men to run across at night. The lake made free with them and slapped their legs and tried to pull them down by the shins like a jealous ant. Ygritte's laugh came out of her in a thread and tugged them on until it broke. She put an arrow at Jon's back and loudly asked the gods where he meant to be buried so they could be on hand. He found a stone to throw back at her. A word rude and true. She laughed again and kept up, and then he could not hear her. He turned once and saw nothing but the white breath of his own fear. He found his way by something that was not the causeway's logic, by wind memory, by the smell of old bitter grass under water, by a sense that the land his father's fathers had walked had left in his blood if not his mind. He did not call it magic. He did not call it anything. He put his feet where they belonged and did not fall. At the far, the reeds closed and men's noises fell behind with the heavy quickness of a runner who knows a door is going to be shut in his face. He ran until he could not, then walked until he could run again, then ran. On a hummock under a scrub of hawthorn that thought itself a tree. He turned, breath hammering in his chest. No one followed except the sound of his own name being unlearned by the snow. He set his nose toward the wall by intuition alone and found north the way a sick man finds his house in a dream. He did not stop long enough to bleed properly. The cut along his cheek had frozen itself into a twisted smile he had not earned. His right thigh had an ache in it that shouted while the rest of him tried to speak reason. He walked anyway. His body learned what it had to. He ate hard cakes that taste of their own cardboard and found them sweet. He slept little and badly, and in places men would not have called beds with a generous tongue. He felt, once, Ygritte within arm's length and did not reach out because sometimes not reaching is the only kind of mercy a man has. In the end, he saw the white bulwark ahead as a man sees a harbor when he is already half dead and found the strength to be angry at it for not coming sooner. Castle Black from the south looks like nothing. That is its trick. Jon reached it at dusk and would have wept if he had had any water left in him for tears. He was seen by no boy on the top. The top was undermanned, the top was always undermanned. He found the postern near the old midden heap and knocked with his body when his hand would not. It opened because men inside had learned to open when the world sounded like that and argue with policy later. Ghost, PYP said, because the dire wolf had come out of the dusk an instant before Jon, and the white of him had written its own name. Then, 7 bloody hells and all their candles. Because the smell of Jon reached him, and the shape of Jon, and the truth of Jon's escape too. He put his hands under Jon's arms as if he were dragging a net, and Gren came and grunted like a man pulling up a root, and the two of them hauled him inside and laughed small laughter that had tears at the edges. You look like something the snow spat out, PYP said, because PYP could not help himself. We were about to start a game without you so the odds would be fair. Sam came with a basin and a face like bread left too long by the hearth, browned and cracked and entirely good. He dabbed Jon's wound as if it were a book and his hand the only clean glove left in the world. Don't talk yet, he said, which was a joke and a command and a prayer. Jon slept one night and woke to a world altered by more than his return. The old bear was gone, not to ranging, not to sleep. Gone in the old hard way that ends every man. Craster's keep had gone the way of all wicked houses when winter makes men hungry enough. Blades out where they should not be. Words shouted that should not be said indoors. Fire licking the rafters out of pure curiosity while blood made everything tacky. Mormont had tried to shame them back into being brothers and instead died proving his own point. Men had killed each other over a pig's food and a woman's fear, and most of those who lived had run so far that their names would never get home. A boy with courage and terror in equal measure named Sam had carried a woman and a child from under the noise and learned that moving in fear is as good as courage when the feet keep working. He had come to the night fort when Winter remembered it was a haunted house and made it so, and he had gone down into the earth with a dead man who was not dead and a cold that was not merely cold, and a gate had opened where men did not know gates existed and a face had spoken out of old white wood and let him pass. He told Jon some of this, and not all, because some stories are the sort a man must keep in his own mouth for a while before trusting anyone else with them. "You look different," Sam said, as if the word he wanted had run off and married another and learned a new name. "Not older. Not that. Tired," Jon said. "Yes," Sam said gratefully, as if Jon had allowed him to put down a burden. "That too." Donal Noy took one look at Jon and handed him a broom because a broom is as much a man's duty as a blade when the world begins to lean. "You can swing that without bleeding on my floor," he said. "When you stop dripping like a butcher's apprentice, I'll give you back your sword." Jon swept, and his back learned again that work and pain can speak comfortably together. By noon he had Longclaw again, and by evening he had men to put in lines and move and curse and encourage because Ser Alistair Thorne had taken an arrow and an insult and was nursing both, and Bowen Marsh had miscounted something important and was furious at arithmetic, and Janos Slint had not yet found in the north a lip to sit his lies on comfortably. Jon drilled boys who had pretended they weren't and old men who had pretended the cold would keep them alive, and he said "loose" in a voice that was different now and men obeyed without taking offense. That was new. He put dragonglass into Sam's hand and then into 3 others, and he said, "It kills them." And it sounded like an old man telling a boy how to light tinder in damp weather. Simple, calm, necessary. The horn came one night like a story men tell each other to stay awake. 1. Friendly, if anything can be said to be friendly at night. 2. Wildlings. 3. Someone on a different night at a different time in a different throat had sounded it. Here it was 2 and 2 again, wicked and patient. Torches bobbed on the far white. The first thrust came at the steps and was thrown off because men can throw off first thrusts when they have planned for them. The second came at the gate with men who thought wood was law. They learned iron has stronger arguments. The third came from the south, slyly, as men with short iron and knit caps ran under the tree line and threw hooks and ropes and made themselves spiders in places where they were not born. Jon ran from top to yard to top again until his legs belonged to someone else and he used them anyway, and he heard in the noise a familiar laugh threaded through a scream. Ygritte came like weather instead of like a person. He did not see her until she was there, shadow and red hair wild with bad intent. Their eyes met across a little space that was large as the world. In it lived everything they had said and not said and meant more, and then the space closed with an arrow whistling through it that did not belong to either of their hands. She went down to 1 knee and then to 2 and sat there with the surprised expression of a girl who has found the apple she was reaching for had a bee in it. He was at her side in breaths. He took her up and his hands were the hands of a man who has broken a thing he meant to keep safe. "You know nothing, Jon Snow," she told him, as she had always told him. But now the words were worn soft with use and kindness, and she was smiling with only the top of her mouth because the bottom had forgotten its work. He said her name, and it was all he could say. He said it as if that would buy them time the way men used to buy bread when there was bread. Her hand found his, not for comfort, for curiosity. What did his palm feel like now that they had both lied to each other properly? Felt warm to her because blood is stubborn. Felt wet to him because blood is honest. She looked at him as if there were a story she had meant to tell him and had not, and then she lay back as if the snow were a bed she recognized and the sky a roof she had always suspected would be hers. He held her until Tormund's roar came from somewhere and made the night remember that it had work to do. The siege did not end that night, nor the next. Giants came up out of the white as if a child had dreamed them into being. Tall, shaggy, eyes deep as wells and just as kind. And men learned to be afraid properly. One of them had a name, Mag the Mighty, they were told after. That night he needed no name, only a gate to break. He and his went for the tunnel where the true gate lay with its old iron and old wood and old spells. Donal Noy went to meet him because a man who has made kings, still does, knows when to die making space for boys to go on lying about being men. He took 6 with him, Gren among them, Gren with his dogged brow and his stubborn heart and the little smile he had when he had accomplished a small thing no one had noticed. They barred the gate and stood with old steel and poor courage that held because sometimes that is what courage does. Mag the mighty came through because gates are only ever a suggestion to giants. They set spears against him and said the old words and Jon only heard about it later and saw the blood trail and the bodies after and the look on PYP's face when he tried to make a joke and could not think of one. Noy died and Gren with him, and the giant's body lay in the cold with dignity because dignity is a thing both men and giants are owed when they have done their terrible work and nothing else remains. Jon took command without being told he had taken it. He set men with bows where there had been none, and he moved others by the collars of their coats when talking would have been more polite and less useful. He told the old to stand in the second line with spears cut short. He told the young to go high where the climb would make them fail less often. He gave the best places to those whose hands did not shake. He did the arithmetic of the dead and the living and found that tonight the numbers were on their side by a narrow mercy. At dawn the wildlings slid away and the yard smelled of blood and wood smoke and men who had been brave and were sick from it. 2 days later the north answered in a voice that had nothing of ice in it. It was iron and horse and banners and men trained to move together not because they loved each other but because they had learned how to pretend. Stannis Baratheon came like a sentence passed down without any wit in it and precisely the right punctuation. His knights rode into the wildling host from a quarter where Mance had not expected men with honor to move so quickly. Honor is often slower, and Stannis had taught his to gallop. The giants broke. The mammoths turned. Men with spears that had done good work against watchmen did poor work against steel knee to shoulder. Mance's camp flew apart like a thatch roof in a gale. The king beyond the wall found himself with less beyond and more on the ground and disappointed, and he did not try to die foolishly. He stood and watched and did not make a speech, and when his men had fled far enough and his women had cried enough and his children were quiet from fear, Stannis's men closed on him and did not cut him. That was mercy. That was calculation. When it was done, snow fell with the peculiar delicacy it sometimes shows after outrage, as if to scold the world for having made a fuss. Stannis rode through the drifts as a man's jaw goes through words, grinding. He wore what he always wore, honesty and the wrong face for it. He stopped in the yard of Castle Black and dismounted with stiff dignity, and his men looked as if they had been taught to be pleased and were not. Jon stood with Ghost and the Black behind him a ragged court. He bowed and did not kneel. Stannis saw and disliked it and accepted it because there are 3 things a king cannot afford to quarrel with: weather, bread, and men he needs. Davos Seaworth, his hand not of birth but of loss, stood at his elbow with eyes that had learned to see mercy in unlikely shapes. Behind them a woman in red observed the world with the calm greed of a fire. She looked at Jon and did not look away, and something in him went colder. "You are the one," she said before Stannis could do a king's work of naming and demands. The accent in her words made them sound as if they had been heated and poured into his ears. "The snow in my flames had a face. You are it." "I am Jon Snow," he said, because facts are a kind of weapon and the simplest often cut cleanest. "Lord Snow," Stannis said with more dryness than a man should have in his mouth after a winter ride. "Bow again. That will do. You did your duty. Men tell me you fought when your elders were running and that without your bow and your voice and the size of your stubbornness, the line would have broken. They also tell me you consort with savages and that your father—" He stopped because the woman in red smiled, very slightly, and Stannis Baratheon liked to find his own way into traps. That Eddard Stark left behind more truths than he had time to tell. "I prefer truths that can fight. Others are fit for songs." Davos had a face like a warm hand and old rope. He looked at Jon and saw a boy who had built himself a man on a bad winter and done tolerably. "There's bread in the hall," he said simply. "And soup." He looked around at the Black brothers with the measure of a man who had learned to count real men and not banners. "And candles." You'll want to see what you're eating for once. Later, when the hall had had its fill of noise and the smell of horse had been conquered by the smell of onion and fat and spilled ale, Stannis sent for Jon and put him before a small square table covered with a skin of the north and its claims. The woman in red sat as if she had been there when men first chose tables over stones. Her eyes were all hunger and all patience. Davos stood like a man who knows number and is content to be a number when the sum is just. Stannis put his finger on Winterfell the way a man chooses a splinter to pull. You know this place. I was a boy in its yard, Jon said. The honesty caught in his throat and came out smooth anyway. I learned the weight of wood there. I learned where my feet belonged in snow. I learned enough. Good, Stannis said. You are the wrong man for what I need and the right one. There are lords I could make of better birth and worse loyalty. There are Starks enough south, some say. He said some say as if it were a coarse cloth he preferred not to touch. Robb Stark is dead because men who had eaten his bread forgot how to chew. The North must be held by someone whose jaw will not tire. I will make you Jon Stark. I will make you Lord of Winterfell. I will give you land and women and the right to call men to die for you when you ask. In return you will bend that stiff neck and name me king while we both live. And you will leave Is Wall and this black and all their old muttering to men who love muttering better than doing. Melisandre turned her face slightly, amused. He has other blood in him, she purred, as if she were commenting on the fatness of a duck. He has a king's blood. He could be more than a Stark. He could be the song my fire teaches me. The snow with a dragon's breath. The night is a long hall with too many doors. Men like him are the keys. I am not a key, Jon said. He did not look at her. He looked at the table and the piece Stannis had placed on Winterfell, some carved dog or bear whose ears had been rubbed smooth by nervous hands. He thought of the godswood pool and the red leaves on the snow. He thought of Robb's hand on his shoulder. He thought of the letter in his boot and the weight it had made with every step. He thought of Maester Aemon's face turned up toward a light only he could see. He thought of the men who had died under this wall because they had been told to and those who had died because they had refused. He thought of the oath that had not cared what blood was in him when he spoke it. I swore, he said, and their faces moved, the king's and the king's hand and the king's priestess. I swore myself to a long hard service. I won't pretend I didn't mean it because I have been offered something sweet. I won't unswear myself to help you hold a castle that will be ash if we do not hold the thing that keeps the cold out. You prefer frost to a warm hearth, Stannis said, contempt without heat, which was the purest kind. I prefer not being a liar when I try to sleep, Jon said. Davos's mouth did a small private thing which, in another man, would have been a grin. Stannis's face might have been a wall for all it betrayed. The woman in red smiled as if she had been told that a goat had chosen to mount a wolf and she had expected it to. Men who will not break, she said. Make the best fuel. Enough, Stannis said, because he did not mind being wrong when it was his choice to be wrong, and he disliked being commented upon when it was not. You will not have Winterfell. I will give it to the next man who merits it and can spell his name without a maester's help. I will give you another chance to be wise. He pushed the piece that had been on Winterfell aside, not enough to drop it, enough to make it clear it no longer occupied the square it had. You will act as my voice here when I have gone west to teach this land the difference between loyalty and tears. You will keep these crows from counting their own shit and calling it grain. You will gather men when men can be gathered. You will open and close this wall as I bid, when it can be done without burning it. If you will not call me king with your kneeling, do it with your work. You owe something to the world that sent you that letter. He had said it without saying it. Jon felt the old words rise in him like a winter sun that would not warm his face. He thought of Eddard Stark writing in the small hand that had given him his first sword to touch. He thought of Lyanna Stark's face in stone under Winterfell, the winter roses fallen at her bare marble feet. He thought of Rhaegar Targaryen's harp sounding like wind under a door. He thought of the smell of ghost's fur when snow first melts on it. He thought of a girl's copper hair and a word spoken in scorn that had been their only way to tell each other true. "I will do my work," he said. "I will hold the wall as far as one man can with other men. I will put my back into your task when it is my task. I will not break what I am to make it easier." Melisandre's eyes had not left him. They were hot and amused and cruel, the way a flame is cruel. It does not intend harm. It is merely itself. "We will see what you are," she said, as if she were putting a kettle on and did not intend to supervise it. "When the night sends me a dream with your face in it, I will tell you which door to go through. And you will go, because there will be someone on the other side you cannot leave to freeze." She lifted her hand and drew a small circle in the air as if to trap a fly. "King's blood is a clean burn. Do not spend it without meaning to. Men do such foolish things with what they are born to." After, Jon walked out under a sky gone thin and brittle. Snow had hardened to a crust underfoot that broke and held him by turns. A child's trick. Ghost appeared out of nowhere because that was Ghost's pride. He pressed his flank to Jon's thigh and then away, laid his muzzle against Jon's palm and then away, as if he were reminding Jon how solid he was when everything else felt like sentences. He led Jon along the outer palisade where the wind could do its work without having to ask permission of stones. The air was so clear that sound seemed to break in it and fall in neat pieces to the ground, where men trod it into silence. "Lord Snow." The voice found him without warning and made him flinch inside. It was the flinch of a boy when a schoolman has caught him reading ahead. Maester Aemon stood within his cloak as a candle stands inside a lantern. The lantern is meant to protect the flame, and sometimes the other way around. His eyes were the soft white of old pearls. They turned toward Jon without needing to see. "I hear you have refused a crown you were not offered," he said mildly. "I did not refuse it," Jon said. "I refused another man's name for me." "Ah," Aemon said, pleased and sad. "That is harder." He stood with him and did the courtesy of not shivering. "When I was young, I was offered a crown I could not have borne and the world was spared that folly. I kept my vows and watched other men break theirs and made my peace with a life of service when my youthful cruel heart had wanted a life of glory. I have had time to learn the value of quiet nights when the breath you take in equals the breath you let out." He tilted his head as the wind ran a thumb down the wall's blue face and made the old stones sing. "You have more in you than you know how to spend. The world will come with its cup and ask you to pour. Learn to measure. That is all I can tell you, and it is not enough." He put his old hand, light, on Jon's sleeve and left it just long enough to be a blessing. In the days that followed, kings left and winter stayed. Stannis took his iron and his will and his lady's fire and went to break men who had never seen a king and did not care to. He left behind the ugly business of keeping men alive. Janos Slynt found cause to admire the strength of doors that close from the inside in hard nights, and to cultivate friends who would feed him. Bowen Marsh bought onions by the cart and forgot salt. Ser Alliser nursed his wound by telling stories of men better than the men who had bled to keep him from dying of it. Sam wrote letters with his big careful hand, even after the quill had split and the ink was a grainy gray, and sent them out on birds that came back because they did not know better. A letter came back one day that had a different weight. It was big for a letter, and heavy with seals, and smelled faintly of wine spilled long ago. It had been written before a hall was ruined and a woman's throat cut and a mother's cry was swallowed by music, and then hidden, and then found, and then traveled with men who would die for having carried it. Jon broke that seal under the raven's disapproving clack and the bed of his mouth went dry as straw. The hand was Robb's, stubborn and spare. The witness marks were a crowd of names that stood up around it like men with their backs to a hearth. Great John Umber, Galbart Glover, Meege Mormont, others who had shouted and then held their peace and put their names where they belonged. It made Jon air. It made him, in a world where men believed paper stronger than blood and sometimes weaker than cowardice, the man to stand in Winterfell and say, "I am Stark and not lie." He stood with the letter while the fire at his shoulder practiced being humble. Ghost nosed his wrist and then, more insistently, the paper. Jon held it away because wolves are not lawyers. He read again the lines where his brother had written down a thing he had no right to give and every right to hope. He thought, dearly and angrily, of Robb's laugh and Robb's grief and Robb's mistake. He folded the letter in on itself until it was a firm square and put it all the way down into the boot where the older letter had rested, where it might rub his ankle raw and keep time with his steps and make a wound if he let it. He did not take it to Stannis. He took it to Maester Aemon, and the old man weighed it in his hand and nodded once and put it in a little chest where he kept his herbs. "It does not make you anything you were not already," Aemon said. "It may save other men's children some hunger, or it may lead them to die in a place that is not worth it. That is how letters are. We still must eat and watch." The days learned to be days again. Jon learned to sit at tables where men counted nails and swore that a chest held fewer than it had yesterday until someone found another pile and the quarrel sank without grace. He learned to read the weather in a new way, as something that might keep men from debts or make them go pay them where they would be killed. He learned to hear Melisandre's feet before she announced herself and to smile politely at the little court she built of gullible men and the few women too hungry for warmth to ask at what price it had been paid. He learned that Davos Seaworth had a hand he had not been born with and that it hurt in an honest way when the cold took it. They spoke sometimes of small things, a boy and a cow and a winter that would never end, and liked each other as far as men can when they would not meet again often enough to quarrel. He sat with Tormund by the gate on a day so white it made the eyes ache and ate stew that had more water than meat. The wildling laughed less. He had the look of a man learning to be a father to orphans he had not asked for. He spoke fondly of Mag the Mighty and then caught himself and drank to drown the grief because he did not know where else to put it. "We'll have to learn manners," Tormund grumbled. "Your little men with their little knives don't like us walking about like wind. We'll have to ask for bread the way you ask for it. I will do it if you teach me the words. But I'll spit in the bowl if they look at me like I am a dog too often." "I'll tell them not to," Jon said. "Good lad," Tormund said. "You're not my lad, but you'll do." At night, when the world went properly still for an hour, Jon climbed the steps to the top of the wall and stood where he had stood as a boy and as a man and in between. The wind there was a thing with hands. It took his hair and tugged it to see if he would object. South was a flat doctrine, north a deep old mystery, and neither cared whether he were Stark or Targaryen or bastard or lord. He put his hand to the ice as he had done the first night and made the bargain again. "I will keep you, you keep them, we will keep each other long enough for morning to remember us kindly." He turned his face up to the stars that he had learned to name in 2 languages and let their cold clean speak into him until he could bear to go down where men made speeches and counted bread and argued about whose turn it was to clean the privies. Sleep came and went as it always had. When it came, sometimes it brought the hall with the harp, and sometimes it brought a girl with a copper laugh, and sometimes it brought a man with a jaw like a soldier's and tired eyes who did not call himself king, and sometimes it brought nothing, and that was best. Once, not long after Davos went south with letters from the watch tied under a bird's leg, the dream changed its weather. The hall was gone, and in its place there was a field of snow scored with black lines like the work of a giant's quill. Above it, a shadow moved, long and slow, a shape that writhed as if it were a serpent taught to fly, and the sound that came with it had no place to sit in his mind. He woke with a small involuntary cry, the way men do when their bodies say, "Get up, you fool," and he went to the window and looked out at the night and saw only the old stars and the slow, patient breath of ice. Ghost came and put his head under Jon's hand as if to say that the world remained, even when it did not feel like it. Jon scratched his ear in that place he liked and sat a while on the stone at the base of the window, back cold, face a little warmer from the direwolf's breath. He thought of dragons because a man with his blood must, and he thought of them as a smith thinks of a blast furnace, useful, dangerous, unsuitable for a house, magnificent, not to be trusted. He thought of the boy he had been and the man he would have to be next week and the one he had refused to become at Stannis's table. He thought of Winterfell and the way his feet used to find the kitchen steps in the dark without his noticing, and he thought of a gray hall and a marble girl and roses that would never melt, and of the letter in his boot, square now, a part of him. He did not know that, far away, a girl with white hair and a title that did not fit any saddle yet stood on a city wall and watched her dragons pull at their chains and loved them and was frightened by how much and how little love does. He did not know that, nearer, A spider spun and listened and spun again and smiled without letting his face break, because it is unwise to let your face break if you mean it to deceive. He did not know that in a lonely tower, a man with a kingslayer's hand and a new habit of saying what he meant rode with a woman who had never been given anything without the demand that she be perfect in return, and that the world would not forgive either of them for trying to be better too late. He knew the wall and the way the wind carved it, and the way some snow squeaked underfoot and some did not, and the way men breathed when they were lying and when they were not. He knew the measure of his own stubbornness. He knew, finally and completely, that the truth of his birth was both a blade and a chain, and that he would carry it as he carried Longclaw, not flinching from it, not showing it off, not letting it make his hand useless with the weight. In the morning he put bread into the hands of a woman with a dirty face and a child at her breast who had once been called savage and would be called something else now that she had been made to stand in line, and he showed a boy how to twist a rope so it would not pull out under strain, and he sent a letter by raven that said only, "We live." He stood in council and did not let his face show what he felt when Janos Slynt spoke in the round tones of a man who had never been north of the Goldcloaks barracks and now meant to tell men who had slept in blood how to fold their blankets. He told Sam that the feather looked less white now, and Sam said that was good, because white shows everything and it was better for a feather to have seen a bit of the world if it meant to hold up an angel. He walked along the ice in the red of evening and thought he heard a harp and then thought better of it and smiled to himself as a man smiles when he learns to forgive his own foolishness. When the summons came for an election, it sounded first like a joke PYP might have made. Men who had only yesterday learned to agree which way to carry a ladder now were expected to choose themselves a father. They did it the way men do most things. Badly at first, noisily after, with bright ideas and little meat on them. Sir Dennis Mallister had a kind voice and good manners and a hall that had given him more salt than blood. Men said yes to him because yes was easier to say than no. Janos Slynt collected his own favor and his own knives and smiled, as if he had borrowed someone else's face for the evening. Cotter Pike drank and swore and frightened 3 boys into running home to the kitchens. Bowen Marsh counted and miscounted and then counted again and found that numbers, like men, do not do as they are told when it matters. Jon did not put himself forward. He watched the way men's eyes moved when the word Lord was used on them and the way their hands moved to suppress the itch of wanting. He thought of Stannis offering him Winterfell, and of Robb offering him a weight he could not take. He thought of Aemon telling him to learn to measure. He thought of Mance in his patchwork cloak sewing his life together where it had torn. He went to Sam and said, "If you can think of a way to keep Janos from counting us all out of our food, think quickly." And Sam, who was always himself even when frightened, thought of 3 and then a 4th, and then set them to work as if he had been born a steward to men's better selves, and in time, by trick and by truth both, Jon was chosen to command in a world where command meant standing at the front of a line when the cold came. He stood before his brothers with Ghost at his heel and an old sword in his hand and spoke vows a second time to men who knew him and men who did not, and he felt them sit in his chest without scraping. He looked across the yard and saw Melisandre smiling and Stannis not smiling and Davos looking like a man counting the cost of a thing he would pay anyway. He saw Tormund grinning as if his own boy had done him proud by stealing an apple under a baker's nose. And he saw Sam standing as if he had been called to recite his letters and had done it and would not make anybody else suffer for it. He saw the sky, precisely itself, and the wall, precisely itself, and the rough, brave faces of the black who were his to keep if he could. He did not think of dragons then. He thought of bread and of boots that needed hobnails and of oil for hinges and of the sound a horn makes when blown 3 times and what he must do when next he heard it. He did not know whether Robb had died calling his name, or whether Catelyn had remembered him as a boy or wished she had never seen him. He did not know what the South would make of a letter in a boot and a rumor in a hall. He did not know whether Stannis would come back with men who wanted to build something, or with ashes that needed sweeping. He did not know whether the woman in red would find his name again in fire and come to him with flint in her eyes and a knife in her mouth. He knew that he would be here when they came, and that the ice would take his hand and his heat both, and that between them they might make a wall high enough for morning to climb. He knew that men with poor boots and good hearts would turn away a giant if they had to, and that women with babies at their breasts would learn to wait in line and call the men giving them bread brothers, and that when the next white shape moved at the tree line, Ghost would go still and Jon would set his hand to dragonglass that felt like a promise he had never asked for and would keep anyway. He stood. He measured. He breathed. He watched the north gather itself like an old wolf before the leap and did not look away.